The moment Avery Cole's $40 million Gulfstream hit the tarmac with a mechanical shudder that shouldn't exist, she knew someone's career was about to end. What she didn't know was that the grease-stained mechanic she was about to humiliate in front of her entire team would become the only person standing between her empire and total collapse. In 60 minutes, she'd learned that pride costs more than any jet engine. In 60 days, she'd discover that the man she mocked knew more about aviation than everyone in her company combined. But first, she had to destroy him. If you want to see how far this story of redemption and unexpected brilliance travels, hit that like button and comment with your city below. The February wind hammered against the hangar doors like an unwelcome creditor, rattling the corrugated metal with a persistence that matched Avery Cole's mounting frustration. She stood in the center of Riverside Regional Airport's maintenance facility, her Valentino heels clicking an impatient rhythm against the oil-stained concrete, surveying the scene before her with the critical eye of someone who'd built an empire by never accepting second best. The Gulfstream G700, her company's flagship aircraft, the crown jewel that had cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, sat wounded and silent, its starboard engine cowling peeled back like a dissected specimen. The sight of it, grounded and vulnerable, sent a particular kind of fury through Avery's veins. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to her planes, not to her company, not to her. "Someone explained to me," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of pneumatic tools and distant thunder, "how a $40 million aircraft that passed inspection 6 days ago is now sitting here like an expensive paperweight." Her team, 3 certified aviation mechanics in company uniforms, her operations manager Derek, and her head pilot Marcus, stood in various positions of defensive posturing. They'd all worked for Cole Aviation long enough to recognize the dangerous calm in her voice, the way her green eyes narrowed slightly when she was calculating exactly how much someone's incompetence was going to cost her. Derek, always the brave one, stepped forward with a tablet in hand. "The diagnostic is showing an anomaly in the fuel flow management system. The sensors are reading normal, but there's clearly a pressure differential that's— I don't need the technical poetry, Derek. I need solutions. Victor Castellano's plane lands in 90 minutes, and he expects this aircraft to take him to Singapore in 2 hours. Do you understand what happens if we can't deliver? We've got Anderson and his team flying in from Charlotte, which is currently under the same weather advisory that's grounding everything within 200 miles. Avery pulled out her phone, glanced at the weather radar, and felt her jaw tighten. "So unless your certified experts have learned to teleport, we need another option." The hangar had gone quiet except for the storm. Even the mechanics who weren't part of her team had paused their work, drawn by the unmistakable sound of a corporate crisis unfolding. Avery hated being watched during moments of vulnerability, hated the exposure of it, but she'd learned long ago that appearing uncertain was worse than appearing angry. That's when she heard it, a low, almost dismissive sound. A half-laugh, half-exhale that carried just enough volume to reach her ears. Her head snapped toward the source. Near the far workbench, partially obscured by a disassembled propeller assembly, a man in faded coveralls straightened up from the equipment he'd been inspecting. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual physical work rather than expensive gym memberships, with dark hair that needed a cut and at least 2 days of stubble shadowing his jaw. His hands, she noticed, were stained with the kind of grease that doesn't wash off easily. "Something amusing?" Avery's voice could have etched glass. The man looked up, meeting her gaze with a directness that most people in her orbit had learned to avoid. His eyes were an unexpected shade of blue-gray, like storm clouds over water, and they held absolutely no deference. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern inflection that placed him somewhere in the Carolinas. "Just nothing amusing at all." "Then perhaps you'd like to explain what's funny about my situation." He set down the torque wrench he'd been holding and wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days. Better years, actually. "Didn't say it was funny. Said it wasn't amusing. There's a difference." Avery felt Derek tense beside her, recognized the protective instinct of an employee who knew his boss was about to verbally eviscerate someone. She held up one hand, stopping him. "And you are?" "Ethan Brooks. I run maintenance for the charter operations on the east side." "How lovely." "Well, Mr. Brooks, since you seem to have opinions about my aircraft, perhaps you'd like to share your expertise?" The sarcasm in her voice was sharp enough to draw blood. Ethan glanced at the Gulf Stream, then back at her, and she saw something flicker across his face. Not fear or intimidation, but something closer to resignation, as if he'd already calculated the trajectory of this conversation and found it predictable. "Not really my place," he said. "Oh, but I insist. Please, illuminate us with your wisdom. I'm sure your experience with— what do you work on? Cessnas? Pipers? I'm sure that translates beautifully to a G700. A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through her team. Ethan's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mostly King Airs and a few citations," he said evenly. "And you're right, different class of aircraft entirely." "Exactly. So perhaps you can return to your appropriate level of machinery and let the professionals handle this." She turned away, dismissing him as thoroughly as if he'd ceased to exist, and refocused on Derek. "Get me options. I don't care if you have to— It's the fuel control unit." Avery stopped mid-sentence, her spine stiffening. She turned slowly, finding Ethan still standing there, still meeting her gaze with that same unsettling steadiness. "Excuse me?" "The pressure differential your diagnostics are showing. It's not the management system sensors. It's the hydromechanical unit in the fuel control assembly. The electronic portion is reading fine, but there's a mechanical valve that's sticking. The system's trying to compensate, which is why your readings look inconsistent." The hangar had gone completely silent now. Even the wind seemed to have paused, waiting. Derek looked at his tablet, scrolling rapidly. That's not what the diagnostic— "The diagnostic can only read what the sensors tell it," Ethan continued, his tone matter-of-fact, almost tired. "And the sensors on that system are downstream of the mechanical components. You're getting accurate data from a system that's responding to an upstream problem." Marcus, her pilot, spoke up for the first time. "That would require a physical inspection of the FCU. We'd need to access the engine core, and that's— "Cowling's already open," Ethan said. 30-minute inspection. Another 30 to confirm and recalibrate, if I'm right." Avery felt something cold settle in her stomach. The confidence in his voice wasn't bravado. It was the quiet certainty of someone who actually knew what he was talking about. But accepting help from this local mechanic, this nobody in his stained coveralls, would be admitting that her expensive team didn't have the answers. "And if you're wrong?" she asked. "Then you've lost an hour you were going to lose anyway, waiting for your team from Charlotte." "Mr. Brooks, I appreciate your input, but this aircraft represents a significant investment, and I'm not going to let some small-time mechanic use it as a learning opportunity." Something flashed in those blue-gray eyes. Not anger exactly, but something harder and colder. When he spoke, his voice remained level, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "You're right, of course. What would I know? I only work on the aircraft that actually keep people alive around here, not the ones that make them feel important." "I beg your pardon." "You should probably get back to your phone calls, Ms. Cole. I'm sure there's a corporate solution that'll cost you twice as much and take 3 times as long. That seems to be how people like you prefer to solve problems anyway." The audacity of it struck Avery like a physical blow. In her world, people didn't talk to her this way. They nodded, they agreed, they executed her vision, or they found themselves unemployed. This grease monkey from nowhere was dismissing her? "People like me," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet, "are the ones who built companies while people like you were content to stay small and comfortable. People like me are the reason aviation exists at this level at all. So before you judge how I solve problems, maybe consider what problems you've ever been important enough to solve." She saw it then. A flash of something raw and painful crossing his features before his expression shuttered completely. He nodded once, that same resignation she'd seen earlier settling over him like a familiar coat. "You're absolutely right," he said. "I apologize for overstepping. I hope you get your aircraft sorted out in time." He turned and walked back to his workbench, shoulders straight, movements deliberate, and Avery felt a savage satisfaction at having put him in his place. Derek was already on his phone trying to find alternative solutions, while Marcus bent over the diagnostic tablet with one of the mechanics. But as the minutes ticked past and the storm intensified outside, that satisfaction began to curdle into something else. Because every option Derek presented led to the same conclusion. They weren't going to make Victor Castellanos' deadline. The best-case scenario had their Charlotte team arriving in 3 hours, an hour after Castellano's scheduled departure. 45 minutes later, Avery stood in the hangar office, staring at her phone as Victor Castellano's assistant delivered the message she'd been dreading. Mr. Castellano is extremely disappointed. He's made alternative arrangements with Prestige Air. He'll be in touch regarding the contract renewal, but you should know that he's exploring other primary carriers. Translation: she'd just lost a $12 million annual contract because she couldn't deliver one flight. She ended the call and resisted the urge to throw the phone across the room. Through the office window, she could see the Gulf Stream, still grounded, still broken, still mocking her with its silence. Her team had tried everything the diagnostics suggested, following every protocol, checking every system the manual indicated. Nothing. And in the far corner of the hangar, she could see Ethan Brooks, back at his workbench, methodically reassembling some component she couldn't identify, completely absorbed in his work. As if her crisis, her failure, her empire trembling on the edge of a reputation-destroying disaster meant absolutely nothing to him. The rational part of her brain, the part that had built Cole Aviation from a single leased aircraft to a fleet of 27 planes, whispered that maybe, just maybe, she should reconsider. But the proud part, the part that had clawed her way up through an industry that didn't welcome women in executive positions, that had fought for every inch of respect and recognition, that part refused to bend. Derek appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Charlotte team is delayed. Weather's gotten worse. They're saying another 2 hours minimum." Castellano just canceled. Damn. Avery, I'm sorry. I should have... Don't. She held up a hand. Whose fault is it doesn't matter right now. What matters is making sure this doesn't happen again. But even as she said it, she knew the damage was done. In aviation, reputation was currency, and she'd just become a bad investment. She watched through the window as Ethan finished whatever he was working on, saw him glance at his watch, an old scratched thing that probably cost less than her shoes, and then reach for his jacket. He was leaving, going home to wherever small-town mechanics went at the end of the day, probably to a simple life with simple problems and simple solutions. The thought filled her with an irrational anger. "Ms. Cole?" She turned to find one of the younger mechanics, a kid named Tyler, standing hesitantly in the doorway. "What?" I was talking to Ethan before he left, and he mentioned that if you change your mind about the inspection, he'd be willing to come back. He said to tell you he doesn't charge for diagnostics, only for fixes, and that he understands pride, but aircraft don't care about it. The kid delivered the message and disappeared before Avery could respond, leaving her alone with the words echoing in her head. Aircraft don't care about pride. She looked back at the Gulf Stream, at the millions of dollars of engineering and luxury sitting useless on her hangar floor, at the symbol of everything she'd built now representing everything she stood to lose. And she thought about Victor Castellano, probably already in the air on a competitor's aircraft. About the other clients who would hear about this failure, who would start questioning whether Cole Aviation was really the premium service they paid premium prices for. About the domino effect of one broken promise in an industry built on absolute reliability. Derek was watching her, she realized, waiting for orders, for direction, for the decisive action that Avery Cole was famous for. She pulled out her phone. "What's his number?" "Whose?" "Brooks. Ethan Brooks. Get me his number." Derek's eyebrows rose, but he was smart enough not to comment. He pulled out his own phone, made a quick call, and then rattled off the digits. Avery dialed before she could reconsider, each ring feeling like a small surrender. "Brooks?" His voice was the same, calm, direct, slightly wary. "It's Avery Cole." A pause. "Ms. Cole, my team says you offered to come back. For a diagnostic." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear sounds in the background. A child's laughter, a cartoon playing on television, the domestic sounds of a life completely foreign to her own. "I did." "Your assessment. The fuel control unit. You were certain?" "Nothing's certain until you look at it, but yeah, that's where I'd put my money." Avery closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to maintain her standards, to protect her brand from the risk of small-town incompetence. But under that noise, quieter but stronger, was the instinct that had actually built her company, the ability to recognize when she was out of options. I need to be clear about something, Mr. Brooks. If you come back here and waste my time, if your assessment is wrong, if you damage anything or make this situation worse, I will make sure everyone in this industry knows your name for all the wrong reasons. Do you understand? I understand that you're scared and you're covering it with threats. I also understand that you're out of options and you know it. So let's skip the intimidation part and get to the part where I fix your aircraft. The sheer audacity of it should have made her hang up. Instead, she found herself almost respecting it. How soon can you be here? 20 minutes. But Ms. Cole? Yes? I need to bring my daughter. Sitter canceled because of the storm, and I don't leave her alone. She'll stay in the office, won't be in the way, but that's the deal. A daughter. Of course he had a daughter, probably a wife too, a mortgage, a normal life with normal complications. The kind of life that Avery had never wanted, had actively avoided, had built her entire existence around not having. Fine. 20 minutes. She hung up and found Derek staring at her with barely concealed surprise. You're really going to let him? I'm really going to let him try. Because if he fails, at least I can say I explored every option. And if he succeeds... She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't want to admit what it would mean if this nobody mechanic could solve a problem her expensive team couldn't. 19 minutes later, headlights cut through the hangar entrance. An old Ford F-250 pulled in. The truck's paint faded and its bumper held on with what appeared to be zip ties and determination. Avery watched from the office as Ethan climbed out, then opened the rear door to help a small figure in a pink raincoat emerge. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, with dark hair and braids and the kind of fearless energy that comes from being loved enough to feel safe anywhere. She clutched a backpack covered in cartoon characters and what looked like mathematical equations drawn in marker. Ethan bent down to her level, said something that made her nod seriously, and then pointed toward the office. The girl took off running, splashing through puddles with the kind of joy that adults forget is possible. She burst through the office door, saw Avery, and stopped. Hi, I'm Sophie. My dad says I have to stay in here and not touch anything expensive. He says you're the boss and you're having a very bad day and I should be extra good. The words tumbled out in one breath, delivered with the brutal honesty of childhood. Avery found herself at a loss, something that rarely happened. Yes, that's correct. He also says that if he fixes your airplane, you'll probably be nicer to him. But I'm not supposed to tell you that part. Sophie's eyes widened in realization. Oops. Despite everything, the stress, the anger, the fear of failure, Avery felt the corner of her mouth twitch. I see. Well, Sophie, you can sit at that desk there. Do you have homework? I have a book about rocket propulsion. I'm on chapter 7. Do you know how much thrust it takes to escape Earth's gravity? No. 11.2 kilometers per second. That's called escape velocity. My dad explained it using a baseball and a really tall building, but Mom's not here to say that's dangerous anymore, so we do a lot of experiments that are probably not super safe. The casual mention of an absent mother hung in the air. Avery saw the flicker of something cross Sophie's face. Loss, carefully contained by a child who'd learned to carry it, and felt an unexpected twist in her chest. Before she could respond, Tyler appeared in the doorway. Ms. Cole, Ethan's ready to start. He wants to know if you want to observe. Oh, she wanted to observe. She wanted to watch him fail, wanted to document every mistake, wanted the satisfaction of being right about his limitations. She followed Tyler back to the Gulfstream, where Ethan had already set up a portable work light and was examining the engine with an intensity that seemed to shut out everything else. He didn't acknowledge her approach, didn't perform for her attention. He simply worked, his movements efficient and purposeful. Talk me through what you're doing, she said, her voice sharp. Looking for the confirmation before I make you a promise. I didn't ask for a promise. I asked for an explanation. He straightened, meeting her gaze over the engine cowling. The FCU has both electronic and mechanical components. The electronic side controls the fuel flow based on input from the FADEC, the Full Authority Digital Engine Control. But the mechanical side is what actually regulates the fuel under different conditions. If there's a blockage or a stuck valve in the mechanical portion, the electronic side can read perfect while the actual fuel delivery is compromised.
And you determined this how? From listening to my team's conversation? From the sound it made when you landed?
Avery blinked.
You heard my aircraft land? I was on the tarmac checking a Beach King Air. Your starboard engine had a flutter in the thrust pattern. Subtle, but there. The kind of irregularity that comes from inconsistent fuel delivery. When I heard your team talking about sensor readings being normal but pressure differentials showing up, it confirmed what I'd already suspected. He turned back to the engine, pulling out what looked like a fiber optic camera attached to a tablet. What I'm doing now is confirming the blockage location before I recommend a course of action. She watched as he threaded the camera into the engine assembly with the kind of careful precision that spoke of deep familiarity. On the tablet screen, she could see the interior of the fuel control unit, the complex maze of channels and valves that regulated one of the most critical systems in the aircraft. "There," Ethan said, freezing the image. "You see that valve assembly?" Avery leaned in, studying the screen. It took her a moment to see what he was pointing at. A slight discoloration, an irregularity in the valve seat. That's contamination, probably from a partial fuel filter bypass during your last refuel. It's creating an incomplete seal, which means the valve can't regulate pressure properly. The electronic system is compensating, but not enough to maintain stable thrust under load. Derek had joined them, looking at the screen with growing recognition. That makes sense. We refueled in Atlanta, and they were having issues with their filtration system. We got clearance, but sometimes contamination is microscopic until it accumulates, Ethan finished. This isn't a failure of your aircraft. It's bad luck combined with a perfect storm of small factors. Avery felt something shift in her understanding. This wasn't incompetence or negligence. It was the kind of problem that could happen to anyone, that wouldn't show up on standard diagnostics because the sensors were reading exactly what they should read from a system that was technically functioning. "Can you fix it?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, still studying the screen. "Yes, but it's going to require accessing the FCU directly, cleaning the contamination, and recalibrating the entire fuel management system. 3 hours of work, maybe 4. I don't have 4 hours. I know. Which is why I'm going to do it in 90 minutes. That's impossible." He looked at her then, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not arrogance, but a quiet, absolute confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of. "No, ma'am, it's just difficult. There's a difference." And then he turned back to the engine and began to work. What Avery witnessed over the next hour and a half would fundamentally alter her understanding of expertise. Ethan didn't just repair the aircraft. He deconstructed and reconstructed a complex system with a fluidity that bordered on artistic. His hands moved with absolute certainty, each motion purposeful, each decision instant and correct. He didn't consult manuals, he didn't call for assistance. He simply worked, and the aircraft responded to his touch like an instrument played by a master musician. Derek and Marcus watched with growing awe, occasionally offering tools or assistance, but mostly staying out of his way. The other mechanics in the hangar had gradually drifted over, drawn by the spectacle of someone working at a level most of them had only aspired to. Avery found herself unable to look away. There was something almost hypnotic about watching someone operate at the peak of their abilities, the way his focus narrowed until nothing existed except the problem and the solution, the way he anticipated issues before they arose, the way he moved through complex procedures as if they were simple. At one point, Sophie appeared beside her, having apparently decided the office was boring. "He's really good, isn't he?" the girl said, her voice soft with pride. "Yes," Avery admitted. "Yes, he is. He used to build much bigger engines. Before." "Before what?" But Sophie just shrugged, her attention already back on her father, and Avery didn't push. Whatever before meant, it clearly wasn't something the child wanted to discuss. 73 minutes after he started, Ethan stepped back from the engine. "She's ready for a test." Marcus didn't hesitate. He climbed into the cockpit, ran through the startup sequence, and when the engine roared to life, the sound was perfect, smooth, powerful, completely consistent. The starboard engine that had been silent and broken was now purring like a satisfied cat. Marcus shut it down and emerged with a grin that Avery rarely saw on her veteran pilot's face. That's the best she's sounded in months. Whatever you did, it's not just fixed, it's better. Ethan was already packing his tools, his movements methodical as he cleaned each instrument before storing it. Recalibrated the whole system while I was in there. You should see about a 2% improvement in fuel efficiency, and the thrust response will be smoother across the power band. Avery stared at him, this man in his stained coveralls with his battered toolbox, and felt the foundations of her assumptions cracking. What do I owe you? He paused in his packing, glanced at her, then at his daughter standing nearby. Nothing. That's not how business works. Wasn't doing business, was proving a point. The words hit her like cold water. Excuse me? He straightened, meeting her gaze with that same unnerving directness. You needed to understand that you don't know everything. That dismissing people because they don't fit your definition of valuable is not just arrogant, it's stupid. I don't need your money, Ms. Cole. I've got enough to take care of my daughter, keep a roof over our heads, and sleep at night knowing I didn't compromise who I am for anyone's approval. Then why did you come back? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer, almost sad. Because Sophie asked me why I let that mean lady talk to me like that. And I had to explain that sometimes people are mean because they're scared, and the best way to handle scared people isn't to get mean back. It's to show them they don't need to be afraid. The simple truth of it, the casual dignity, the complete absence of malice or revenge, it undid something in Avery's chest. I wasn't scared, she heard herself say. Yes, you were. You still are. Being successful doesn't make you immune to fear, Ms. Cole. It just gives you better ways to hide it. He zipped up his toolbox, called Sophie over, and started toward his truck. Avery stood frozen, unable to process the conflicting emotions warring inside her, gratitude and shame and anger and something else she couldn't quite name. Mr. Brooks. He stopped, turned. I was wrong. About you. About everything I said. He considered this, then nodded once. Yes, you were. No forgiveness, no easy absolution, just acknowledgement of fact. How do I make it right? A slight smile touched his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. You start by questioning your assumptions about what makes people valuable, about what defines expertise, about whether the price tag on something determines its worth. He hoisted Sophie onto his shoulders, making her giggle. But mostly, you just try to be kinder. The world's hard enough without us making it harder for each other. They were almost to his truck when Avery called out again. The tattoo on your arm, the one I saw when you were working, that's an engine schematic. He stopped, his back still to her, and she saw his shoulders tense. Not just any engine, she continued, her mind racing through possibilities. That's a Pratt & Whitney PW800, the propulsion system for the Gulfstream G500 and G600, one of the most advanced turbofan engines in civilian aviation. Slowly he turned. His expression had shuttered completely, walls slamming down behind his eyes. You know what that tattoo means, Mr. Brooks? It means you didn't just study that engine. It means you were intimately involved in its development. Because nobody gets to that level of detail tattooed on their body unless it means something profound. Sophie was looking between them, confused by the sudden tension. Dad? It's okay, sweetheart. Wait in the truck. But now please. The girl obeyed, sliding off his shoulders and running to the Ford. When she was safely inside, Ethan walked back toward Avery, and there was something different in his bearing now. A weariness that aged him beyond his years. You should let it go, Ms. Cole. What if I can't? Then you're going to have to accept that some questions don't get answers. Some people have lives before the ones you see. And sometimes those lives end for reasons that don't concern you. Ethan Brooks, she said slowly, testing the name. I knew an Ethan Brooks once. Read about him, actually. He was a lead propulsion engineer at Pratt & Whitney. Brilliant, by all accounts. One of the youngest lead engineers they'd ever had. He was instrumental in solving a catastrophic flaw in the PW800 development that would have set the program back years. And then suddenly, he wasn't. She saw the confirmation in his eyes, even though he said nothing.
The article said he left the industry, family reasons. No one knew where he went. She gestured around the modest hangar. Apparently he went here. Apparently. Why? Because Sophie needed a father more than the world needed another engineer. Because when my wife died giving birth to her, I had a choice to make. I could keep building engines that might kill me through stress and 70-hour work weeks, or I could be there to watch my daughter grow up. I chose her. I'd choose her again. The raw honesty of it, the complete absence of regret or self-pity, struck Avery silent. So you walked away from what had to be 7 figures, from prestige, from everything you'd worked for. I walked away from a life that would have made me miss her first word, her first step, her first everything. I walked away from becoming my father, a brilliant man who I barely knew because he was always working. I didn't walk away from anything, Ms. Cole. I walked toward something much more important. He turned back toward his truck, and this time Avery didn't stop him. She watched him drive away, the old Ford's taillights disappearing into the storm, and felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she understood about success, about value, about what it meant to make the right choice. Derek appeared beside her, following her gaze. Did you know? Not until the tattoo, but it makes sense now. Everything makes sense. What are you going to do? Avery looked at the Gulfstream, perfectly repaired by a man who'd given up everything to be a father. Looked at her team, her empire, her carefully constructed world of achievement and recognition. I'm going to think, she said quietly. For the first time in a very long time, I'm going to actually think about what I'm doing and why. The storm continued outside, but inside the hangar something had shifted. The aircraft was fixed, the crisis was averted. But Avery Cole, who had built an empire on certainty and control, found herself facing questions she'd never allowed before. And in a modest house across town, Ethan Brooks was probably reading his daughter a bedtime story, completely unaware that he'd just dismantled someone's entire worldview with nothing but competence, dignity, and an unwavering understanding of what actually mattered. The most powerful engines, Avery was beginning to realize, weren't always the ones that flew the fastest or cost the most. Sometimes they were the ones that knew when to stay grounded. The call came at 2:30 in the morning, 3 weeks after the Gulfstream incident. Avery had been dreaming, one of those rare, unsettling dreams where she was back in her father's auto shop, 10 years old again, trying to prove she could change oil as well as any of the boys he employed. She woke to her phone vibrating against the nightstand, the name Derek, emergency, glowing in the darkness. This better be catastrophic, she said, her voice rough with sleep. Victor Castellano's plane just declared an in-flight emergency. They're 40 minutes out from emergency landing here. He's demanding you personally oversee the situation, and Avery, he's bringing everyone. The entire board of Castellano Industries. This is the contract meeting. Avery was already out of bed, her mind shifting from sleep to tactical operations in seconds. What's the emergency? Hydraulic failure in the primary flight control system. They're on backup, but the pilots aren't comfortable continuing to Singapore. They need a full inspection and repair before they'll fly again. Who do we have on site? A pause. The kind of pause that meant bad news. Night crew is minimal. Anderson's team is in Miami. Marcus is there, and we've got 2 mechanics, but neither one is rated for the hydraulic systems on a Bombardier Global 7500. Avery was already pulling on clothes, her mind racing through options. The Bombardier Global 7500 was Castellano's personal aircraft, a $90 million flying palace that made her Gulfstream look modest. It was also one of the most complex private aircraft in existence, with systems that required specialized certification to repair. How long to get certified technicians on site? 6 hours minimum. And that's if we can find someone willing to fly out in the middle of the night. 6 hours. Castellano would never wait 6 hours. He'd already lost faith in Cole Aviation once. This was her chance to prove her company's worth, to reclaim the contract that represented nearly 15% of her annual revenue. Failing again wasn't an option. It would be a death sentence for her reputation. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Have the hangar prepped and ready. Get me every schematic and manual for the Global 7500's hydraulic system. And Derek? Yeah? Find out if Ethan Brooks is available. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Avery, are you sure? I mean, after what happened,
After what happened, he fixed a problem my certified team couldn't solve in a fraction of the time with zero resources. Yes, I'm sure. Call him. She hung up before Derek could argue, grabbed her keys, and was in her Mercedes within 3 minutes. The roads were empty at this hour, streetlights creating pools of amber in the darkness, as she pushed the car faster than was strictly legal. Her mind wouldn't stop calculating, running through scenarios, trying to find a path that didn't end in complete disaster. Castellano was her white whale, the client who represented everything she'd built her company to attract. Wealthy beyond measure, connected to networks of similarly wealthy individuals, and demanding enough that satisfying him meant you could satisfy anyone. Losing him once had hurt. Losing him twice would be professionally fatal. The hangar was blazing with light when she arrived, a beacon against the pre-dawn darkness. She could see the approach lights of an aircraft in the distance, descending toward the runway with the slightly asymmetric posture of a plane flying on backup systems. Derek met her at the entrance, tablet in hand, his hair standing up in directions that suggested he'd dressed even faster than she had. Brooks isn't answering his phone. Then someone needs to go get him. Avery, it's almost 3 a.m. He's got a kid. We can't just... We can, and we will. Send Tyler. He lives closest. She snatched the tablet from Derek's hand, scrolling through the hydraulic system schematics. What's the failure mode? Primary accumulator is showing 0 pressure. The system's running on the backup, but there's also indication of fluid loss, which means we're probably looking at a leak somewhere in the primary circuit. Avery felt her stomach tighten. A hydraulic leak on a Global 7500 could be anywhere in a system that ran through the entire aircraft. Finding it would be like searching for a specific blood vessel in a human body, possible, but requiring someone who knew the anatomy intimately. The Bombardier touched down with a smoothness that belied its compromised state, the pilots clearly skilled enough to handle the degraded controls. As it taxied toward the hangar, Avery could see faces in the windows, Castellano and his board, watching, judging, calculating whether Cole Aviation was worth their continued investment. The aircraft came to a stop, engines winding down, and the door opened. Victor Castellano emerged first, a silver-haired man in his 60s who wore a 3-piece suit at 3 a.m. as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His eyes found Avery immediately, and she saw the assessment in his gaze, the weighing of her worth, the measuring of her competence. Ms. Cole, we seem to make a habit of meeting under unfortunate circumstances. She forced a smile that felt like it might crack her face. Mr. Castellano, I assure you, we'll have you back in the air within hours. Hours? His eyebrow rose. I was told this is a complex hydraulic failure. I was told your facility doesn't regularly service Global 7000s. I was told, in fact, that I should perhaps consider alternative arrangements. You were told incorrectly. We have specialists en route, and my team is already diagnosing the problem. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had one specialist potentially en route, assuming Tyler could wake him up and convince him to come save her again. Castellano's board members were emerging now, a collection of executives and lawyers who looked distinctly unhappy about their interrupted flight. One of them, a sharp-faced woman Avery recognized as the CFO, spoke up. Mr. Castellano, I really think we should contact Prestige Air. They have a global certified team in Charlotte who could take just as long to arrive as anyone else, Avery interrupted smoothly, and who would then need time to diagnose before even beginning repairs. My team is here now, knows this facility, and has access to every resource we need. She said it with complete confidence, as if Ethan Brooks were already in the hangar instead of hopefully being roused from sleep by a mechanic 20 years his junior. Castellano studied her for a long moment, and she held his gaze, refusing to let him see the desperation beneath her composure. 6 hours, he said finally. If the aircraft isn't ready to fly safely in 6 hours, we're making other arrangements. And Ms. Cole? This contract negotiation we were supposed to conduct in Singapore? Consider it happening right here, right now. Every decision you make, every delay, every mistake, that's all part of my assessment of whether Cole Aviation deserves my business. Understood. She watched them file into the hangar office, where Derek was already setting up coffee and the kind of expensive pastries that you had to order from a bakery that didn't even open until 5. Then she turned to Marcus, who was standing by the Bombardier with 2 mechanics. Tell me something good. Marcus's expression told her there was nothing good to tell. Hydraulic fluid on the tarmac under the port side. System diagnostics confirm primary accumulator failure and active leak in the main distribution line. We need to trace the entire port hydraulic circuit to find the source. How long? For us, maybe 8 hours if we're lucky, and that's just finding it. Repair time depends on what's actually damaged. 8 hours. 2 hours more than she had. 2 hours that might as well be 2 years for all the difference it would make to Castellano's decision. The sound of an engine outside made her turn. Tyler's Honda pulled up to the hangar entrance, and after a moment, the passenger door opened. Ethan climbed out, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, his hair damp as if he'd dunked his head under a faucet to wake up. His face was set in an expression that suggested he was there under protest. Sophie emerged from the back seat, wrapped in a blanket and clutching a stuffed airplane, her eyes half closed with sleep. "I tried to find a neighbor," Tyler was saying apologetically, "but he said she comes with him, or he doesn't come at all." Ethan walked toward Avery, his daughter drowsy on his hip, and stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You've got a lot of nerve," he said finally. "I know. Dragging my kid out of bed at 3 in the morning because you're in over your head again. I know. You haven't even apologized for last time. You didn't give me the chance. You proved your point and left." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe, that she'd admit it so plainly. Sophie stirred against his shoulder, mumbling, "Dad, I'm tired." "I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry." He looked at Avery. "She needs somewhere safe to sleep. The office has a couch. It's quiet, private." He considered this, then nodded. Derek appeared to show him the way, and Avery watched as Ethan carefully settled his daughter on the office couch, tucking the blanket around her, brushing hair from her face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough hands. Sophie murmured something Avery couldn't hear, and Ethan smiled, a real smile, so different from the guarded expression he wore around everyone else, and whispered something back. When he emerged from the office, his expression had hardened back into neutrality. "Show me the aircraft." They walked to the Bombardier in silence. Marcus started to explain the situation, but Ethan held up a hand, stopping him. Instead, he circled the plane slowly, his eyes tracking along the fuselage, the landing gear, the subtle evidence of hydraulic fluid on the tarmac. He knelt beside the port landing gear, running his fingers along the surface, then brought them to his nose, smelling the fluid. Type 4 hydraulic fluid, phosphate ester base. He stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. How fast was the pressure loss? Marcus checked his notes. Initial alarm came on about 20 minutes before landing. Pressure dropped to 0 in the primary system over 15 minutes. That's slow for a catastrophic failure, more consistent with a seal failure than a line rupture. Ethan moved to the access panel on the port side, examining the latches. "I need to see the hydraulic bay." One of the mechanics spoke up, an older man named Crawford. "That requires depressurizing the entire system and accessing through the wheel well. Minimum 2 hours just to get visual on the main distribution manifold." "Not if you know the shortcut." Ethan was already pulling tools from the kit Tyler had grabbed from his truck, his movements efficient and purposeful. He removed an access panel that Avery hadn't even known existed, revealing a narrow maintenance channel that ran along the interior of the fuselage. "This is a service access for the hydraulic lines. Bombardier added it after the first production run because techs were spending too long accessing the distribution system. It's not in the standard manuals because it's only on aircraft manufactured after 2021. He glanced at the tail number. "This one's a 2023 model. Should have the access." He was right. Within 10 minutes, he had a fiber optic camera threaded through the service channel, the tablet display showing the intricate network of hydraulic lines that fed the aircraft's flight control surfaces. Avery found herself leaning in, watching his face more than the screen. There was something mesmerizing about watching someone work at this level, the way his eyes tracked details she couldn't even see, the way his hands moved with absolute certainty. "There." He froze the image, pointing to a connection point where 2 hydraulic lines met at a manifold junction. "See that discoloration around the coupling?" Marcus squinted at the screen. That could just be normal oxidation." "On a 2-year-old aircraft?" "No, that's hydraulic fluid seepage. The coupling seal is failing. Probably was a slow leak for weeks, maybe months. Finally gave out completely during cruise altitude pressure differential. Crawford was shaking his head in something close to awe. How did you even see that? That's maybe 2 millimeters of discoloration. Because I know what I'm looking for. Ethan was already pulling the camera back, his mind clearly moving to the next phase. The seal itself is a standard part. We should be able to source it locally. But the coupling is going to need to be torqued to exact specifications, and the entire system will need to be bled and pressure tested before flight certification. How long? Avery asked, though she almost didn't want to hear the answer. Ethan checked his watch. 4 hours. Maybe 3.5 if nothing goes wrong. Castellano gave me 6. Then you'll have time to spare. He started gathering tools, organizing them with the same systematic precision he brought to everything. But I'm going to need help, real help, not people standing around watching. Marcus, you know hydraulic systems? Enough to follow instructions. That'll work. Crawford, you're on tool management and system monitoring. Tyler, you're my runner. Anything I need, you get it, no questions. He looked at Avery. And you need to keep Castellano and his people away from this aircraft. I can't work with executives breathing down my neck asking questions every 5 minutes. Ethan, he's not going to just sit quietly in the office. Then I guess you're about to learn how to manage client expectations under pressure. Because if you want this bird flying in time, that's the deal. There was no room for negotiation in his tone, no space for her authority or her ego. He was setting the terms because he was the only one who could deliver what she needed. Fine, she said. But Ethan, if this goes wrong, it won't. The certainty in his voice was absolute, and against all her instincts, Avery found herself believing him. The next 3.5 hours existed in a space outside normal time, where the only things that mattered were precision, focus, and the gradually solving puzzle of the Bombardier's hydraulic system. Avery stationed herself as a barrier between the work and Castellanos' increasingly impatient questions, updating him every 30 minutes with carefully measured information that conveyed progress without promising completion. Through the office window, she could see Ethan working, his movements economical and purposeful. He'd removed his flannel shirt, working in just a t-shirt that showed the tattoo she'd glimpsed before, the Pratt & Whitney engine schematic wrapping around his forearm like a reminder of who he used to be. Sophie woke around 4:30, appearing at Avery's elbow with her stuffed airplane and a serious expression. Is my dad almost done? I think so. Are you hungry? A little, but mostly I'm worried. Avery knelt down to the girl's level, an impulse she didn't fully understand. Worried about what? That you're going to be mean to him again if he doesn't fix it fast enough. Adults get mean when they're scared, and you seem really scared. The observation, delivered with the blunt honesty of childhood, hit harder than any of Castellano's veiled threats. I'm not going to be mean to him, Sophie, I promise. Good. Because he's the best at fixing things, but he doesn't like to brag about it. Mom used to say he was too humble for his own good. She said the world needed people like him to remind everyone else that being smart didn't mean you had to be loud about it. Your mom sounds like she was very wise. Sophie's face brightened. She was a doctor. Dad has pictures and she's wearing a white coat and she looks really important. But Dad says the most important thing she ever did was teach him that people matter more than being important. The words settled into Avery's chest like stones, heavy and uncomfortable. She thought about her own life, built entirely around being important, around achievement and recognition and the constant striving for more. When was the last time she'd prioritized a person over a goal? When was the last time she'd even thought to ask the question? At 5:47 a.m., Ethan emerged from the aircraft, his hands stained with hydraulic fluid, his face lined with exhaustion. He found Avery immediately. It's done. Systems pressurized, sealed, and tested. No leaks, pressure holding steady. You'll want your pilots to run through the full checklist, but she's safe to fly. Avery felt something release in her chest, tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying draining away. You're certain? I don't say things I'm not certain about, Ms. Cole. She called Castellano, watched his face shift from skepticism to surprise as his pilots confirmed Ethan's assessment. The board members gathered around the tablet displaying the aircraft's system diagnostics, seeing the green indicators that showed every system functioning within normal parameters.
Castellano approached Avery, his expression unreadable. I'm impressed. I admit, I didn't think you'd pull it off. My team is excellent. Your team is standing over there looking confused. That man, he pointed at Ethan, who was washing his hands in a work sink. He's the reason my aircraft is ready to fly. Who is he? Before Avery could answer, the CFO spoke up, her eyes sharp with recognition. I know who he is. Ethan Brooks. He used to be at Pratt & Whitney. There was a profile on him in Aviation Week 4 years ago, the engineer who solved the PW-800 crisis. He disappeared from the industry right after. There were rumors about personal tragedy. Castellano's interest intensified. That Ethan Brooks is working as a mechanic in a regional hangar. That Ethan Brooks, the CFO continued, was considered one of the most brilliant propulsion engineers of his generation. The article said he could have written his own ticket to anywhere, and now he's here. They all turned to look at Ethan, who had noticed the attention and was trying to ignore it, gathering his tools with deliberate focus. Ms. Cole, Castellano said slowly, why exactly is a world-class aerospace engineer doing freelance mechanic work at 3 a.m? Avery met Ethan's eyes across the hangar and saw the resignation there, the understanding that his past had caught up with him whether he wanted it to or not. You'd have to ask him. But Castellano was already walking toward Ethan, his board members following like sharks scenting blood in the water. Avery moved to intercept, some instinct telling her this was about to go in a direction Ethan wouldn't want. Mr. Brooks, Castellano extended his hand. Victor Castellano, I believe I owe you a significant debt of gratitude. Ethan shook his hand briefly. Just doing my job. Your job? Forgive me, but I think we both know you're significantly overqualified for this kind of work. Qualifications are relative. Perhaps. But talent isn't. I'm always looking for exceptional people, Mr. Brooks. What would it take to bring you on as a consultant for my fleet operations? The offer hung in the air, pregnant with possibility. Avery saw several of her team members exchange glances, saw Derek's expression shift to concern. This was how it happened, how talent got poached, how the good ones always got pulled away to bigger opportunities. I appreciate the offer, Ethan said carefully, but I'm not available for that kind of work. Name your price. Seriously, people with your expertise don't come along often. It's not about money. Then what is it about? Ethan glanced toward the office where Sophie was visible through the window, drawing something on a piece of paper with intense concentration. It's about being there when she wakes up. It's about every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference, every moment of her childhood. It's about promises I made and a life I chose. So no, Mr. Castellano, I'm not available, at any price. The CFO spoke up, her tone sharp. That's remarkably short-sighted. You're wasting your potential. I'm using my potential exactly where it matters most. And with respect, ma'am, you don't get to define what waste looks like in my life. The silence that followed was profound. Avery found herself holding her breath, watching Castellano's reaction, seeing him reassess Ethan with new eyes. I apologize, Castellano said finally. You're right. I shouldn't have assumed. He paused, then smiled slightly. Though I have to say, it takes rare integrity to turn down the kind of opportunity I just offered. Or rare clarity about what actually matters. Castellano laughed, a genuine sound that surprised everyone. Ms. Cole, you have excellent people working for you, even if they're not technically employees. That speaks well of your judgment. He turned back to his board. I think we've seen enough. Cole Aviation will retain our contract with the standard renewal terms plus a 15% increase for demonstrating exceptional crisis management. Avery felt relief flood through her, so intense it was almost painful. Thank you, Mr. Castellano. Don't thank me. Thank him. And Mrs. Cole, whatever you're paying Mr. Brooks, it's not enough. As Castellano and his people boarded the now repaired Bombardier, Avery found herself standing next to Ethan, both of them watching the pre-flight preparations in silence. You could have taken that offer, she said quietly. No, I couldn't. It would have changed your life. My life doesn't need changing. It needs protecting. She understood then, in a way she hadn't fully grasped before, that Ethan wasn't running from his potential or hiding from his past. He was actively, deliberately choosing something different, something she'd spent her entire adult life convinced was incompatible with excellence. I still haven't properly thanked you for tonight, for last time. You gave Sophie breakfast and a safe place to sleep. That's thanks enough. That's not, she started, then stopped, realizing she didn't actually know what would be enough. What do I owe you, financially, for tonight's work? He named a figure that was less than a quarter of what the job was worth, what any certified technician would have charged for emergency after-hours work. That's insulting. That's the rate. Ethan, Ms. Cole, I don't need your money. I need to take my daughter home, make her breakfast, and get her to school on time. The rest is just noise. He collected Sophie, who waved sleepily at Avery before tucking her head against her father's shoulder. As they walked toward his truck, the sun just beginning to break over the horizon, Avery felt something shift inside her, a crack in the armor she'd spent decades building, letting in light she hadn't known she was missing. The bombardier took off 20 minutes later, climbing into the dawn sky with the grace of perfect engineering. Derek appeared beside her, coffee in hand. We kept Castellano, that's huge. We kept Castellano because Ethan Brooks saved us. Again. So what now? Avery watched the contrails fade against the brightening sky and realized she didn't have an answer. For the first time in her professional life, she didn't have a plan, didn't have a strategy, didn't have the next 3 moves calculated and ready. All she had was the lingering image of a man who'd turned down fortune and recognition because he'd rather be there when his daughter woke up, and the uncomfortable recognition that maybe, just maybe, he understood something about success that she'd missed entirely. The problem with revelation, Avery discovered over the following weeks, was that once you started seeing things clearly, you couldn't unsee them. The cracks in her carefully constructed worldview widened with each passing day, letting in uncomfortable truths about the life she'd built and the assumptions she'd used as foundation stones. She found herself watching people differently now. The way Derek's hands trembled slightly when Castellano's name appeared on caller ID, the nervous energy of someone whose worth was perpetually being evaluated, the way her pilots checked their phones obsessively between flights, missing their families, living out of hotel rooms because the schedule demanded it, the way her mechanics worked with quiet competence, never quite receiving the recognition that the pilots and executives took for granted. And she thought about Ethan Brooks more than she cared to admit, about the choice he'd made that still seemed impossible to reconcile with everything she understood about ambition and talent and success. It was Marcus who brought her the news on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Bombardier incident. He found her in her office reviewing quarterly projections, the kind of numbers that used to fill her with satisfaction, but now just felt like abstract measurements of something she couldn't quite define. "We've got a situation," he said, his tone careful in the way it got when he was about to deliver bad news. "The prototype." Avery's attention sharpened immediately. The prototype. A modified Cessna Citation X that Cole Aviation was developing as a proof of concept for a new regional luxury charter service. It represented 18 months of development, 7 figures in investment, and the potential to open an entirely new market segment. What kind of situation? Engine failure during the test flight. We had to make an emergency landing at Piedmont Regional. The engine's toast, complete turbine failure. And Avery, the certification flight with the FAA is scheduled for Monday, 4 days from now. She felt her stomach drop. The FAA certification was the linchpin of the entire project. Without it, they couldn't begin commercial operations, couldn't recoup their investment, couldn't prove to their investors that the concept was viable. Postponing would mean rescheduling months out, losing momentum, potentially losing the entire opportunity. What are our options? Marcus's expression told her she wasn't going to like the answer. Replace the engine, but the Citation X uses Rolls-Royce AE 3007C engines. They're not exactly sitting on shelves. Best case scenario, we source one and have it shipped in a week, maybe 10 days. Then installation and testing, we're looking at 3 weeks minimum. That's unacceptable. I know, but those are the realities. Avery stood, paced to her window overlooking the hangar. She could see the empty space where the prototype should have been, the absence of it like a missing tooth. 3 weeks would kill the project. Their investors would pull out.
the FAA slot would be gone, and 18 months of work would dissolve into expensive lessons learned. What about rebuilding the existing engine? Avery, the turbine section is destroyed. You can't rebuild that kind of damage. It would take specialized knowledge of the AE3007 architecture, access to parts that are nearly impossible to source, and frankly, expertise that we don't have in-house. She turned to face him, an idea forming that she both wanted and dreaded. But we know someone who has that expertise. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. You can't be serious. The PW800 and the AE3007 are different engines, but the fundamental architecture is similar. If anyone could assess whether a rebuild is even possible, Ethan Brooks walked away from that world. You heard him turn down Castellano's offer. What makes you think he'd take this on? Because it's temporary. Because it's a specific problem with a defined endpoint. Because... She stopped, unwilling to finish the thought out loud. Because maybe, just maybe, he'd do it for her if she asked the right way. She pulled out her phone before she could reconsider, found his number in her recent calls, and pressed dial. It rang 4 times before his familiar voice answered, cautious and questioning. Ms. Cole, I need your help. The words came out more abrupt than she'd intended, stripped of the careful phrasing she'd planned. A long pause. With what? Engine failure on a prototype Citation X. Complete turbine destruction on a Rolls-Royce AE3007C. I need to know if it's rebuildable, and if it is, I need someone who can do it in 4 days. 4 days to rebuild a turbine section? That's not realistic, even with perfect conditions and unlimited resources. I'm aware of the challenges, but I'm asking anyway. Will you at least look at it? Another pause, longer this time. She could hear sounds in the background. Sophie's voice asking something, Ethan's muffled response. Where's the aircraft? Piedmont Regional, about 40 miles from here. I'll look at it tomorrow, but Ms. Cole, I'm not promising anything beyond an assessment. Understood? Understood. Thank you. She hung up and found Marcus staring at her with an expression somewhere between concern and curiosity. You're putting a lot of faith in him. Faith has nothing to do with it. I'm making a calculated decision based on observed competence. Right. That's definitely all it is. There was something in Marcus's tone that made Avery look at him sharply, but he'd already turned away, leaving her alone with her thoughts, and the uncomfortable realization that maybe her chief pilot saw more than she wanted anyone to see. The next morning, Avery drove to Piedmont Regional herself, arriving before Ethan to ensure everything was prepared. The Citation sat in a maintenance hangar, looking wounded and vulnerable with its engine cowling removed, exposing the damaged turbine like an open wound. The mechanic who'd been overseeing the emergency landing walked her through the failure sequence, showing her the catastrophic damage where a turbine blade had separated, cascading through the engine and destroying everything in its path. Never seen anything like it, the mechanic said, shaking his head. These engines are built to contain blade failures. Something had to be seriously wrong for it to cascade like this. Avery was studying the damage when she heard an engine outside. That familiar sound of Ethan's aging Ford pulling into the lot. He emerged alone this time, dressed in work clothes that had seen better days, carrying a toolbox that was probably older than Sophie. He walked directly to the aircraft without greeting her, his attention immediately focused on the destroyed engine. For several minutes, he said nothing, just circled the installation, examining it from every angle. Then he pulled out a flashlight and leaned in, his movements methodical and precise. Talk to me about the failure sequence, he said, not looking away from the engine. The mechanic ran through it again, the sudden vibration, the catastrophic noise, the emergency shutdown protocol, the safe landing. Ethan listened without interrupting, his hands now probing the damaged sections, feeling for something Avery couldn't see. Finally, he straightened up, his expression grim. You had a manufacturing defect in one of the turbine blades. See this fracture pattern? He pointed to a piece of twisted metal. That's fatigue failure from an internal flaw, probably a void in the forging process. It was waiting to fail, just a matter of time. Can it be rebuilt? Avery asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Ethan was quiet, still examining the wreckage. The turbine section is completely destroyed. The combustion chamber has secondary damage. The compressor section has foreign object damage from blade fragments. Normally, I'd say no. This engine is scrap. Normally, Avery repeated, catching the qualifier. Normally, you'd have time and resources and the option to just replace it. You have none of those things. He moved to his toolbox, pulled out a tablet, and started taking detailed photographs of the damage. There's a possibility, slim but possible, that we could rebuild this using a hybrid approach. Salvage what's salvageable, source critical components from alternative suppliers, and essentially remanufacture the damaged sections. In 4 days. In 4 days, working around the clock, with access to specialized equipment, a team of people who know what they're doing, and a significant amount of luck. He looked at her directly. And even then, Ms. Cole, I'd give it maybe a 30% chance of success. Those aren't good odds. No, they're not, which is why you should probably pursue other options. There are no other options. This is it. Rebuild it or lose everything we've invested. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition of stakes he understood all too well. If I do this, and that's a significant if, I need complete control. No interference, no second guessing, no corporate oversight breathing down my neck. I work my way or I don't work at all. Done. But I need access to whatever resources exist. Machine shops, specialty suppliers, anyone with expertise in Rolls-Royce engine. You'll have it. And I need you to understand that even with everything going perfectly, this might not work. You could invest 4 days and significant money and still end up with a dead engine and a missed certification. I understand the risks. He studied her for a long moment, and Avery had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing past her professional mask to the desperation beneath. Why does this matter so much to you? He asked quietly. The question caught her off guard, stripped away the business justifications she'd prepared. Because I built this company from nothing. Because every aircraft, every contract, every success represents years of being told I didn't belong in this industry. Because this prototype is supposed to prove that I can innovate, not just operate. Because... She stopped, surprised by her own honesty. Because I need to prove I'm more than just someone who's good at managing what already exists. Ethan nodded slowly, as if he recognized something in her admission. I'll need to bring Sophie. School's out for teacher work week, and I don't have alternative childcare arranged. That's fine. We'll set up a space for her, whatever she needs. Then I'll start today. But Ms. Cole, you need to prepare for the possibility that this doesn't work. She wanted to argue, to demand certainty, to insist that failure wasn't an option. But looking at the destroyed engine, at the impossible timeline, at the enormous complexity of what she was asking, she could only nod. What followed was 4 days that existed outside normal time, where the boundaries between day and night blurred into a continuous stream of work, problem-solving, and incremental progress toward an uncertain goal. Ethan transformed the Piedmont hangar into a precision workshop, bringing in equipment Avery didn't even know existed, calling in favors from contacts she was surprised he still had, working with a focused intensity that was almost frightening in its completeness. Sophie set up residence in a corner office, spreading out her homework and books, occasionally wandering out to watch her father work with the quiet pride of a child who understood her parent was doing something important. Avery found herself gravitating toward the girl, drawn by curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. "What are you reading?" she asked on the second day, finding Sophie curled up in a chair with a book that looked far too advanced for her age. "It's about astronauts. Did you know that the Apollo spacecraft used hypergolic propellants that ignite on contact? That's so cool because you don't need an ignition system." I did not know that. Isn't that a bit advanced for second grade? Sophie shrugged. Dad says if I'm interested in something, there's no such thing as too advanced. I just have to ask questions about the parts I don't understand. He says that's what real learning is, being comfortable with not knowing everything yet. The simple wisdom of it, delivered in a 7-year-old's matter-of-fact tone, struck Avery with unexpected force. When was the last time she'd been comfortable admitting she didn't know something? When had she traded curiosity for the appearance of competence? Through the office window, she could see Ethan working on the turbine section, his hands moving with microscopic precision as he aligned components that had to fit within tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Marcus had brought in 2 of their best mechanics to assist, But it was clear that Ethan was operating on a different level entirely, not just technically, but conceptually, seeing solutions that required reimagining what was possible. On the third day, a problem emerged that threatened to stop everything. One of the critical turbine components, a section called the high-pressure turbine disc, was damaged beyond repair, and sourcing a replacement was impossible in the time frame they had. Avery found Ethan in the machine shop at 2 in the morning, surrounded by reference materials and technical drawings, his face lined with exhaustion. "There has to be a solution," she said, more statement than question. "There might be, but it's not conventional, and it carries risk." "Tell me." He pulled up a CAD drawing on his laptop, showing the damaged component overlaid with a new design. "I can manufacture a replacement using a different approach, laser sintering with a high-temperature alloy. It's newer technology, not typically used in certified aircraft engines, but the material properties are actually superior to the original forging. But it's never been done on this engine model. I'd have to validate the design through testing that normally takes weeks. I'd be asking the FAA inspector to certify an aircraft with a non-standard component based on theoretical performance data and my reputation." "Can you make it work?" "Technically, yes. Politically? That's the question." Avery thought about the FAA inspector assigned to their certification, a by-the-book career bureaucrat named Richardson, who'd already expressed concerns about their timeline. Asking him to approve an unproven component would be a hard sell. What if I could get pre-approval? If I could convince Richardson that the approach is sound before you manufacture the part? Ethan looked at her with surprise. "You think you can do that?" "I think I can try. You focus on the engineering. Let me handle the politics." What she didn't tell him was that convincing Richardson would require calling in every favor she had, leveraging every relationship, and quite possibly promising her firstborn child. But watching Ethan work, seeing the careful brilliance of his solution, she found herself willing to do whatever it took. The conversation with Richardson happened at 6 the next morning, in his office 40 miles away, and it was every bit as difficult as she'd anticipated. He listened to her explanation with increasing skepticism, interrupting with technical questions that she couldn't fully answer, pointing out regulatory precedents that seemed to close every avenue she suggested. "Ms. Cole, what you're proposing is essentially asking me to stake my career on an unproven technology implemented by a mechanic, by one of the most accomplished aerospace engineers of his generation," Avery interrupted. Ethan Brooks was the lead propulsion engineer on the PW-800 program. He solved problems that Pratt and Whitney's entire engineering department couldn't crack. The only reason he's not still there is because he chose family over career, which should tell you something about his integrity. Richardson's expression shifted slightly, recognition dawning. "That Ethan Brooks? I read the technical papers on the PW-800 combustion optimization. That was brilliant work. And he's bringing that same expertise to this problem. I'm not asking you to approve something sketchy, Robert. I'm asking you to recognize that sometimes the best solutions come from people who understand the engineering at a level that transcends standard procedures." She spent another hour walking him through Ethan's approach, showing him the calculations and material specifications, making the case that what appeared unorthodox was actually more rigorous than the standard approach. Finally, Richardson leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're putting a lot on the line for this, aren't you? The prototype, your company's reputation, your own credibility." "Yes. Why?" "You could walk away, write this off as a learning experience, try again next year." Avery thought about the easy answer, the business case, the investor expectations, the competitive advantages, but sitting across from Richardson, exhausted and honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be, she found herself giving the real answer. "Because Ethan Brooks is teaching me something I didn't know I needed to learn. He walked away from everything I spent my life chasing, and he did it without regret, without bitterness, without losing his excellence. He's showing me that maybe success and sacrifice don't have to be synonyms, and if he's willing to put his expertise on the line for my project, the least I can do is fight for him to get the chance." Richardson was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, get me the complete technical specifications by tonight. If the engineering is as sound as you say, I'll expedite the review. But Ms. Cole, If this goes wrong, it won't. Not because I'm lucky, but because I finally started trusting people who are better than me at things that matter. She made it back to Piedmont by 9 a.m., found Ethan in the fabrication area, and delivered the news. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw genuine surprise cross his features. "You got Richardson to agree? How?" "I told him the truth about who you are and why that matters. Turns out your reputation still carries weight, even if you've been out of the industry." Something complicated passed through his expression, gratitude mixed with discomfort, as if being recognized for his past was both validating and unwelcome. "Ms. Cole, Avery, I think we're past formalities at this point." "Avery, then, you didn't have to do that. You could have let this project fail and nobody would have blamed you for an impossible timeline." "You're right. I could have. But I'm learning that sometimes the impossible is just difficult wearing a disguise." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his tired face, and Avery felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction exactly, though she wasn't naive enough to deny that existed, but recognition. Recognition of someone who operated by principles she was only beginning to understand, who'd made choices that terrified and inspired her in equal measure. The final 24 hours became a blur of precision work and careful testing. Ethan manufactured the replacement turbine disc, his hands steady despite exhaustion, his focus unbreakable despite the pressure. Marcus and the mechanics worked in shifts, supporting his efforts, learning from his methods, gradually understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sophie fell asleep on the office couch around midnight, and Avery found herself sitting beside the sleeping girl, watching her father work through the window. The child stirred, mumbled something about rocket engines, and Avery carefully adjusted the blanket around her small shoulders. "She loves him very much," Marcus said quietly, appearing with coffee. "It's mutual. You can see it in everything he does." "Can I ask you something? What happens after this? Assuming we pull this off, what's the plan with Ethan?" Avery realized she didn't have an answer. She'd been so focused on getting through the crisis that she hadn't thought beyond it, hadn't considered what came next. "I don't know. He's made it clear he's not interested in traditional employment." "Maybe that's not what you should be offering." Before she could ask what he meant, one of the mechanics called out that the engine was ready for test mounting. Avery and Marcus joined Ethan at the aircraft, watching as the rebuilt engine was carefully installed, each connection verified, each system checked and double-checked. At 4:47 a.m. on Monday morning, with the FAA certification flight scheduled for 10 a.m., Ethan stepped back from the aircraft. "She's ready." The test start procedure was meticulous and nerve-wracking, every person in the hangar holding their breath as the rebuilt engine spooled up. But when it reached operating temperature and power, the sound was perfect, smooth, consistent, powerful. Everything an AE 3007C should be. Richardson arrived at 9:30 for the pre-flight inspection, and Avery watched as he examined every detail of Ethan's work, checking measurements, reviewing documentation, asking technical questions that Ethan answered with quiet confidence. Finally, the inspector straightened up, made some notes on his tablet, and nodded. "This is exceptional work, Mr. Brooks. I'll be honest, I've never seen a field rebuild of this quality. You've essentially remanufactured a certified engine in 4 days using unconventional methods and somehow made it better than original specification." "The original had a manufacturing defect," Ethan said simply. "I just made sure the replacement didn't." The certification flight went perfectly. The Citation X performed exactly as designed, the rebuilt engine showing performance metrics that exceeded the baseline data. When they landed and Richardson signed off on the certification, Avery felt relief so profound it was almost painful. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, with an impossible timeline, they'd actually done it. The celebration in the hangar was muted by exhaustion, but genuine. Marcus broke out the expensive whiskey he kept for special occasions. The mechanics congratulated each other, and Sophie woke up just in time to see her father being thanked by people who finally understood what Avery had known for weeks, that Ethan Brooks was operating on a level most of them would never reach. As the crowd dispersed and people began heading home, Avery found Ethan cleaning his tools with the same methodical care he brought to everything. She watched him work for a moment, searching for the right words. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did." You fought for the approval, trusted my approach, gave me what I needed to work. That's thanks enough. It's not, though. What you did here, Ethan, you saved my company. This prototype is going to open doors I've been trying to unlock for years. He paused in his cleaning, looked up at her with those storm gray eyes. Then I'm glad I could help. But Avery, you need to understand something. This doesn't change who I am or what I want from life. I did this because it was a specific problem with a defined end, not because I want back into the world I left. I know, I do, but... She stopped, unsure how to articulate what she was feeling. You've changed how I see things. Success, priorities, what actually matters. I built Cole Aviation by sacrificing everything else, and I thought that was necessary. Watching you, seeing how you've built a life that honors both your daughter and your abilities, it's making me question all of it. Good. You should question it. The world tells us we have to choose excellence or balance, achievement or family, success or humanity. But that's a false choice sold by people who benefit from our exhaustion. Sophie appeared then, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and Ethan immediately shifted his attention, kneeling down to her level. Ready to go home, sweetheart. Did you fix the airplane? We did. It's all better now. I knew you would. You're the best at fixing things. She looked at Avery, suddenly shy. Thank you for letting me stay here, and for the snacks. Dad never gets the good snacks. Avery found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. You're welcome any time, Sophie. As they walked toward the parking lot, Avery trailing behind, she noticed something on Ethan's arm that she hadn't seen before. The tattoo was catching the early morning light, revealing details that distance had previously obscured. She'd seen the overall schematic before, recognized it as the PW800 engine. But now, closer, she could see annotations, notes written in tiny script around the technical drawings. She moved closer, unable to stop herself, and read the words that circled the turbine section. For Sarah, who taught me that the best engines run on love, not ambition. The inscription hit her like a physical blow, the raw honesty of it, the permanent reminder of a choice made and a person lost. Ethan noticed her attention, glanced down at his arm, and his expression shuddered slightly. My wife. She's the reason for all of it, leaving Pratt and Whitney, choosing this life, understanding what actually matters. She saw who I was becoming, saw the cost of chasing prestige, and she asked me what I really wanted my legacy to be. I didn't get to answer before she died, but Sophie is the answer. Sophie is always the answer. Avery felt tears threaten, not just for his loss, but for the clarity of his choice, for the certainty that she'd never had about anything except her company. She would be proud of you, of the father you've become, the life you've built for Sophie. I hope so. I try to make it the life she would have wanted for our daughter, safe, full of love, grounded in what's real rather than what's impressive. He lifted Sophie into his truck, secured her seatbelt with practiced efficiency, and then turned back to Avery one last time. What you do with what you've learned, that's up to you. But Avery, you're brilliant at what you do. You just need to decide if what you're doing is actually what you want to be brilliant at. He drove away as the sun climbed higher, leaving Avery standing in the parking lot with a certified prototype, a saved company, and more questions than she'd ever allowed herself to ask. Richardson approached, his inspection complete, holding out the certification documents. Congratulations, Ms. Cole. Your prototype is officially certified for commercial operation. She took the papers, stared at them without really seeing them, and realized that the victory felt hollow in a way she hadn't expected. Robert, can I ask you something? Off the record? Sure. Do you love what you do? Not just appreciate it or find it satisfying, but actually love it. He considered the question seriously. Honestly, I used to. When I first started with the FAA, every certification felt like making aviation safer, contributing to something important. Now, mostly it feels like checking boxes and managing liability. The love got lost somewhere in the procedures. How do you live with that? I tell myself I'm being realistic. The passion is for young people who haven't learned yet that work is work, not calling. He paused, looking at her intently. But watching Ethan Brooks work these past few days, seeing someone operate with that level of love for the craft, that unwillingness to compromise excellence, it reminded me what I gave up.
So I guess the answer is I don't live with it well. I just live with it. He left her with that, walking to his car, and Avery stood alone in the empty parking lot, holding certification papers for a prototype that represented everything she'd worked toward and feeling the weight of everything she'd worked away from. Marcus found her there 20 minutes later, still standing, still holding the documents. "You okay?" "I don't know. I should be celebrating. We did it. The impossible timeline, the certification, all of it. Cole Aviation is about to enter a new market segment with a competitive advantage that'll take others years to match. This is success by any definition. But I can't stop thinking about Ethan going home to make his daughter breakfast, about how that matters more to him than anything we accomplished here, about how he turned his back on a career that people would kill for, and he doesn't regret it even a little." Marcus leaned against his car, studying her with the frank assessment of someone who'd known her long enough to speak truth. "You want to know what I think? I think you're finally asking the right questions, not about business strategy or market positioning or competitive advantage, but about what you're actually building and why. And that's terrifying because you might not like the answers. I built Cole Aviation from nothing. You did, and it's impressive as hell. But Avery, empires are easier to build than lives. You've mastered the first. Maybe it's time to learn the second." She watched him drive away, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her success and the uncomfortable recognition that Ethan Brooks, in walking away from everything she valued, had somehow found something infinitely more valuable that she'd never even known to look for. The sun was fully up now, the new day beginning, and Avery stood at a crossroads she hadn't seen coming, certified prototype in hand, company secured, and absolutely no idea what came next. The questions followed Avery through the next 6 weeks like persistent shadows, reshaping how she saw everything she'd built. She found herself in board meetings calculating not just profit margins, but the human cost of each decision. She caught herself wondering if the pilot missing his son's birthday for a repositioning flight was worth the operational efficiency. She started noticing the exhaustion in Derek's eyes, the way her team worked through weekends, not because they loved it, but because the culture demanded it. The certified prototype performed flawlessly, generating exactly the market interest she'd anticipated. 3 regional carriers had already submitted bids for service contracts, and her investors were thrilled with the projected returns. By every metric that had mattered for the past decade, Cole Aviation was succeeding at unprecedented levels. But Avery couldn't shake the image of Ethan Brooks driving away in his beaten Ford, more satisfied with making his daughter breakfast than most people were with their greatest achievements. She tried to move forward, to recapture the drive that had always fueled her, but something fundamental had shifted. The victory felt incomplete in ways she couldn't articulate, the success somehow hollow despite its tangible results. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in early April, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, the voice on the other end was young, uncertain, clearly uncomfortable. "Ms. Cole? This is Tyler, from the hangar." "Tyler, hello. What can I do for you?" A pause, the sound of him gathering courage. "It's about Ethan. Something's wrong, and I didn't know who else to call." Avery felt her pulse spike. "What do you mean something's wrong?" "He's been working on a King Air all week. Owner needed it ready for a charter run to Boston yesterday. Everything was fine until the test flight. Engine showed an intermittent pressure fluctuation that Ethan couldn't track down. He's been here for 3 days straight trying to solve it, barely sleeping, and Ms. Cole, he won't leave, won't go home to Sophie. He keeps saying he can't let the owner down, can't compromise on safety, but he looks like he's about to collapse." "Where's Sophie?" "With a neighbor, I think. But that's the thing. Ethan called me an hour ago asking if I knew anyone who could watch her for another night because he can't figure out what's wrong, and he won't stop until he does. He sounded, I don't know how to describe it, defeated, maybe. Like something broke." Avery was already grabbing her keys, her mind racing. "I'm on my way. Don't let him leave." "I'm not sure I could stop him if I tried, ma'am, but I'll do my best." The drive to the Eastside Charter Facility took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Avery's mind spun through possibilities, trying to understand what could push someone as grounded as Ethan to this point. He'd walked away from prestigious positions, turned down lucrative offers, maintained absolute clarity about his priorities.
What could make him abandon those principles now? She found him in the hangar exactly as Tyler had described, haunted, exhausted, staring at the King Air's engine with the desperate focus of someone who'd run out of answers. His clothes were rumpled, his face unshaven beyond its usual stubble, his hands trembling slightly as he consulted a diagnostic tablet for what was probably the 1,000th time. Ethan. He looked up and she saw genuine surprise flash across his features, followed quickly by wariness. Avery, what are you doing here? Tyler called. He's worried about you. Tyler needs to mind his own business. The words came out harsher than intended, and Ethan immediately looked guilty. I'm sorry. This problem should be solvable, and I can't solve it. 3 days, and I still can't find what's causing the pressure fluctuation. When's the last time you slept? I don't know. Does it matter? When's the last time you saw Sophie? His expression crumpled for just a moment before he forced it back under control. Sunday night. Mrs. Patterson is watching her. She's fine. But you're not fine. I will be, once I solve this. The owner's counting on me. He has a critical business meeting in Boston, passengers who need to be there, people whose plans depend on this aircraft being ready. He turned back to the engine, his movements jerky with exhaustion. I can't just walk away because it's hard. That's not who I am. Avery moved closer, really looking at him now, at the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the slight shake in his hands that spoke of someone running on empty. This wasn't the calm, confident engineer she'd watched work miracles. This was someone unraveling, pushed past breaking by something she didn't yet understand. Talk to me. Help me understand what's happening here. Nothing's happening. I'm doing my job, trying to solve a problem. For 3 days without sleep? For 3 days without seeing your daughter? The Ethan Brooks I know wouldn't sacrifice Sophie for any client or any aircraft. He flinched at that, as if she'd struck him. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sagged against the workbench, the fight draining out of him, leaving only exhaustion and something that looked like shame. The owner is David Patterson. He's Mrs. Patterson's husband, the neighbor who's been watching Sophie. They've been helping me for 3 years, ever since I moved here. Every time I needed someone, every time Sophie was sick, or school had an early release, or I had an emergency, they were there. They never asked for anything in return, just helped because that's who they are. Understanding began to dawn. And now he needs you. His company is struggling. This meeting in Boston is with potential investors who could save everything he's built. If he misses it because his aircraft isn't ready, because I couldn't do the one thing I'm supposed to be excellent at, Ethan's voice cracked. How do I look him in the eye? How do I look at Mrs. Patterson, knowing I failed the one time they needed me after everything they've done for us? So you're killing yourself trying to solve an impossible problem. It's not impossible. It can't be impossible. I'm just missing something, some detail, some connection I haven't made yet. He pulled up the diagnostic data again, his eyes scanning numbers that probably didn't register anymore. I have to figure it out. Avery studied him, seeing clearly now what she'd missed before. This wasn't about aviation or excellence or professional pride. This was about debt and gratitude and the crushing weight of owing something to people who'd become family. Okay, she said quietly. Show me what you found. He blinked at her. What? Show me the problem. Walk me through everything you've checked, every test you've run. Maybe a fresh perspective will help. Avery, you're not an engine mechanic. No, but I'm good at systems analysis and problem solving. And right now you need someone who isn't running on 3 days of no sleep and emotional exhaustion. So show me. For a moment she thought he'd refuse. Then slowly he began walking her through the problem. The intermittent pressure fluctuation that appeared randomly during operation. The dozens of components he'd checked and rechecked. The diagnostic data that showed everything functioning normally even when the problem manifested. He spoke in technical terms she didn't fully understand, but she listened anyway, watching not just his words but his process, looking for gaps that exhaustion might have created. You've checked the fuel system completely? 3 times. The electrical connections to the sensors? Verified continuity on every circuit. What about environmental factors? Temperature, humidity, vibration patterns that might only occur under specific conditions? Logged everything. There's no correlation. She looked at the engine, then at the diagnostic equipment, then back at the data on his tablet. Something nagged at her, a pattern she couldn't quite grasp. The fluctuation. You said it's intermittent. Is there any pattern to when it occurs? No, that's what's driving me crazy. Sometimes within minutes of startup, sometimes not for an hour. No consistent trigger. But it always occurs eventually? Yes. Every test flight, it shows up at some point. Avery thought about systems she understood, business operations, workflow patterns, the way complex organizations developed failure modes. What if the trigger isn't mechanical? What if it's cumulative? Ethan looked at her, confusion evident. What do you mean? You're looking for a specific cause, a broken component, a faulty sensor, something discrete. But what if the problem is the accumulation of small variances? What if individually, everything is within tolerance, but collectively, those tolerances stack up to create the fluctuation? She saw the moment understanding hit him, the way his eyes widened slightly, his exhausted brain making connections it had been too tired to see before. Tolerance stack up. Multiple components, each within specification individually, but combining to create an out-of-spec condition. He pulled up a different diagnostic screen, his fingers moving faster now. If the fuel flow sensor is at the high end of tolerance, and the pressure regulator is at the low end, and the compensating valve is responding based on nominal values, then you'd get intermittent fluctuations as the system tries to reconcile inputs that are technically correct but practically incompatible. Avery finished, not entirely sure she understood her own words, but trusting the recognition in his expression. Ethan was already moving, pulling components, checking measurements against specification sheets, comparing actual values to nominal ranges. 20 minutes later, he straightened up, something like wonder crossing his exhausted features. You're right. Every component is within spec, but they're all stacked at opposite ends of their tolerance ranges. The system can compensate under most conditions, but when certain factors combine, altitude, temperature, engine load, the stack-up creates the pressure fluctuation. He looked at her with genuine awe. How did you see that? I didn't really. I just thought about how failures happen in systems I understand. Sometimes it's not one broken piece. It's a dozen small things that individually don't matter, but together create problems. He paused, shook his head slightly. That's actually brilliant systems thinking. Most engineers get so focused on individual components they miss the interaction effects. Can you fix it? Easily. Replace the components that are at extreme tolerance ranges with ones closer to nominal values. 2 hours of work, maximum. He was already making notes, his energy returning now that he had a solution. Then he stopped, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You drove all the way here to help me. Tyler called. He was worried. No, I mean, you could have just told him to send me home. Instead, you came here, listened to me rant about a problem you had no reason to care about, and helped me solve it using an approach I never would have considered. He set down his tools, giving her his full attention. Why? The question hung between them, weighted with everything unsaid over the past weeks. Avery could have deflected, could have given him a professional answer about reciprocity or networking or maintaining relationships. Instead, she found herself giving him the truth. Because you've helped me 3 times now, when you had no obligation to. Because watching you work has changed how I see my own life. Because Tyler said you sounded defeated, and I couldn't stand the thought of someone like you. Someone who's walked away from everything I chase, being broken by trying to help people who helped you. Someone like me, he repeated softly. What does that mean? Someone who has their priorities right. Someone who knows what actually matters and lives accordingly, even when it's hard. Someone who makes me question whether everything I've built is actually worth what it cost. Ethan studied her for a long moment, and in his tired eyes she saw understanding dawn, recognition that they'd crossed some invisible line from professional acquaintances to something more complicated. Avery, I need to tell you something about why I really left Pratt and Whitney. You told me. Your wife died and you chose Sophie. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. He leaned against the workbench, his exhaustion evident but his voice steady. Sarah didn't just die. She died because I wasn't there. I was in Germany,
testing the PW-800 in a simulated high-altitude chamber, chasing perfection on an engine that was already good enough. She went into labor early, had complications, needed someone to make medical decisions, and I was 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, unreachable. By the time I landed, she was gone and Sophie was in the NICU fighting for her life. The rawness of it, the self-recrimination he'd clearly carried for years, made Avery's throat tighten. That wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I chose to be in Germany. I chose the engine over being there for my pregnant wife's final trimester. I told myself it was necessary, that the work mattered, that I was building something important. And maybe I was. But Sarah died alone, making impossible decisions by herself because I was more committed to a turbine than to her. Ethan, when I held Sophie for the first time, this tiny person fighting so hard to live, I made her a promise. I promised that I would always be there, that I would never choose anything over her, that she would never wonder if she mattered more than my work. That's not nobility, Avery. That's penance. That's me trying to be the father I should have been preparing to be instead of chasing engineering perfection. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with years of guilt and grief and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. Avery understood then why he'd reacted so strongly to being away from Sophie for 3 days, why the debt to the Pattersons had pushed him to breaking, because in his mind, any failure to prioritize people over work was a betrayal of the promise he'd made to his daughter and the memory of his wife. "You're not doing penance," she said quietly. "You're being a father, a really good one." Sophie doesn't see someone atoning for past mistakes. She sees someone who loves her enough to build a whole life around her needs. Maybe, but that life doesn't leave room for much else. Not for the kind of career people think I should have, not for relationships that require more than I can give, not for anything that might pull my attention away from her. The message was clear, and Avery felt something in her chest constrict at the finality of it. Whatever this was between them, respect, attraction, the pull of two people who'd inadvertently changed each other's perspectives. It had a boundary he couldn't cross. I understand. Do you? Because I see how you look at me sometimes, and I need you to know that it's not... I can't offer you anything beyond friendship and occasional professional help. Sophie has to come first. Always. I know, and honestly, Ethan, I don't think I'm in a place to offer you anything either. I'm still figuring out what I want my life to be, questioning foundations I thought were solid. You've made me see possibilities I didn't know existed, but I haven't actually changed anything yet. Maybe that's the real work then, not the dramatic gestures or the grand revelations, but the slow, daily choice to build something different. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression immediately softened. It's Sophie. She's asking when I'm coming home. He typed a quick response, then looked at Avery. I need to fix this King Air and get back to her. But Avery, thank you for coming here, for helping me see the solution, for being someone I can trust. Go take care of the aircraft. Go take care of your daughter. And Ethan, Mrs. Patterson isn't going to judge you for taking 3 days to solve a complex problem. She's going to be grateful you cared enough to get it right. She left him to his work, drove back to her office as evening settled into night, and sat at her desk staring at quarterly projections that suddenly seemed less important than they had that morning. Her phone buzzed with a message from Derek about a new contract opportunity in Singapore, and she found herself thinking not about the business potential, but about the pilots who'd have to be away from their families for weeks at a time. 3 days later, the crisis that would force her hand arrived in the form of Marcus walking into her office with an expression she'd never seen before. Pure, unconcealed fury. I need to talk to you, and I need you to actually listen instead of calculating your response. Avery set down her pen, surprised by his tone. What's wrong? Sarah quit, just walked into my office and resigned, effective immediately. Sarah's our best charter coordinator. Why would she? Because we scheduled her for weekend duty for the 6th consecutive month, and she missed her son's birthday party, his school play, and his soccer championship game. Because when she asked for 1 weekend off to be with her family, we told her that client needs come first, because she finally realized that no amount of money is worth never seeing her kid. The words hit like physical blows, each one landing with the weight of recognition.
Avery thought of Sophie asking when her father was coming home, of Ethan's exhausted face after 3 days without sleep, of the promise he'd made to a daughter fighting for life. "We'll hire a replacement." "That's it? That's your response?" "Avery, this is the third person we've lost this quarter to burnout. Good people, talented people, people who loved this industry until we ground them down. And you want to just replace them like they're malfunctioning components?" "What do you want me to do, Marcus? Clients have needs, schedules have to be maintained, operations they require people, actual human beings with lives and families and needs beyond their job descriptions. And if we can't figure out how to run this company without destroying the people who make it work, then maybe we need to rethink what we're doing." He left before she could respond, and Avery sat in the silence of her office, feeling the careful structure of her worldview cracking along fault lines she'd been trying to ignore. That night, she did something she hadn't done in years. She went home before 8 p.m., poured herself a glass of wine, and actually thought about what she wanted her legacy to be. Not Cole Aviation's legacy, not her professional reputation, but hers personally. What did she want people to say about her when she was gone? What did she want to have built that mattered beyond profit margins and market share? The answers that came weren't comfortable. She thought about Sarah choosing her son over her career, making the same choice Ethan had made. She thought about her team, exhausted and ground down by expectations they could never quite meet. She thought about herself, successful beyond measure, but somehow emptier than she'd ever admitted. And she thought about Ethan Brooks, who'd walked away from everything she valued and somehow found something infinitely more valuable in the process. The decision formed slowly over the next week, taking shape through conversations with Derek and Marcus, through nights of reflection, through careful examination of what actually made her company successful. She reviewed financial projections, consulted with HR about policy changes, ran numbers until her eyes burned. Finally, on a Friday afternoon, she called a company-wide meeting. Her entire staff gathered in the main hangar: pilots, mechanics, coordinators, everyone who made Cole Aviation function. They looked at her with various degrees of curiosity and wariness, clearly uncertain what this unscheduled assembly meant. "I'm making some changes," Avery began, her voice carrying across the space. "Not to our operations or our client service or our safety standards. Those remain excellent. I'm making changes to how we treat the people who deliver that excellence." She outlined the new policies she'd spent the week developing: mandatory time off, strict limits on consecutive work weekends, family emergency protocols that didn't require approval from 3 levels of management, flexibility for parents to attend important events. Each announcement was met with varying degrees of surprise, skepticism, and carefully controlled hope. "I know this sounds sudden," she continued, "and I know some of you are wondering if this is sustainable or if I've lost my mind. The truth is, I've been learning from someone who has his priorities right in ways I never did. And I realize that building a successful company by burning out good people isn't success. It's a slower form of failure." Derek spoke up from the back. "What about client demands? What happens when someone needs weekend service and our coordinator is off? We hire more people. We build redundancy into our staffing. We charge premium rates for emergency service and use those revenues to ensure we're not dependent on overworking our current team. We get creative about solutions instead of defaulting to exhausting our people." Marcus was watching her with an expression somewhere between approval and disbelief. "This is going to cost money. The investors won't like it. Then we find new investors, or we accept slightly lower profit margins in exchange for sustainable operations. Because I'd rather run a smaller company with happy employees than a larger one that consumes people." She saw the moment her team began to believe she meant it, saw the subtle shift in posture, the glances exchanged, the careful recalibration of expectations. And she felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. After the meeting, after the questions and the discussions and the gradual dispersal of staff, Marcus found her in her office. "That took guts. That took watching Ethan Brooks work himself to collapse trying to help someone who'd helped him. That took Sarah choosing her son over her career. That took seeing what I'd built and realizing the cost wasn't worth the result. So what now?" Avery looked at the quarterly projections still open on her computer, the numbers that defined success in terms she was beginning to question. Now I figure out how to build something better. Not bigger necessarily, but better. Not just profitable, but sustainable. Not just successful, but worth the lives we're investing in it. And Ethan? Is he part of this new vision? She thought about that question, about the boundaries he'd drawn, about the promise he'd made to a daughter in a NICU. Ethan has his own life, his own priorities, but yeah, I think he'll be part of it. Not as an employee or a consultant, but as a reminder of what matters, as a standard to measure against. 3 days later, she drove to the East Side hangar, found Ethan working on a routine maintenance job, and waited until he noticed her. Avery, what brings you here? I need your advice, professional advice, and I'm willing to pay your actual rate, not the insulting number you usually charge. He set down his tools, wiped his hands, and gave her his full attention. About what? I'm restructuring how Cole Aviation operates. New policies around work-life balance, family priorities, sustainable staffing, but I need help figuring out how to make it actually work instead of just being corporate platitudes. You've built a life around these principles. I want to understand how to translate that to organizational scale. Ethan studied her for a long moment. You're serious about this? Completely. You showed me that the way I've been operating isn't sustainable, isn't humane, and ultimately isn't even good business. I want to change it, but I don't want to just create a different version of the same problem. I want your perspective on what actually works. Avery, I'm not a business consultant. I'm a mechanic who chose family over career. You're someone who understands what matters and builds accordingly. That's exactly the expertise I need. He glanced toward the office where Sophie was visible through the window, working on homework at a small desk he'd set up for her. This would have to be on my terms. Limited hours, Sophie comes with me, no commitments that interfere with her schedule. Those are exactly the terms I'm hoping to build into my entire company. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. When do you want to start? Over the next month, Ethan became an irregular but invaluable presence at Cole Aviation, offering perspective that transformed how Avery thought about operations. He pushed back on policies that sounded good but weren't practical, suggested alternatives based on his own experience balancing fatherhood and expertise, forced her to question assumptions she didn't even know she was making. And slowly, carefully, something shifted between them. Not romance exactly, but partnership grounded in mutual respect and shared values. They worked together with increasing ease, their different perspectives complementing rather than conflicting, building something neither could have created alone. The changes weren't perfect, and they weren't easy. Some clients complained about reduced availability, some investors questioned the new cost structure. But gradually, tangibly, Cole Aviation began to transform into something more sustainable, more humane, more aligned with the values Avery was learning to prioritize. And through it all, Sophie was there, doing homework in corners of the office, asking questions about aerodynamics, reminding everyone through her presence what actually mattered. Avery found herself watching the girl, seeing in her the future that Ethan had chosen to protect, understanding more deeply with each interaction why that choice had been worth everything he'd given up. One evening, as they finished reviewing new scheduling protocols, Sophie looked up from her book. "Dad, is Avery your friend now?" Ethan glanced at Avery, something soft in his expression. "Yeah, sweetheart, I think she is." "Good. She's nice, and she brings better snacks than you do." Avery laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded in a way that would have surprised her 6 months ago. "That's because your dad thinks granola bars count as treats." "They're nutritious." "They're boring," Sophie declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Avery's cookies are way better." Watching them, the easy affection, the gentle teasing, the foundation of love that shaped every interaction, Avery felt something settle into place. Not completion exactly, because her life was still in flux, still being rebuilt, but purpose, direction, the sense that she was finally building towards something that mattered beyond quarterly projections. She'd spent a decade chasing success defined by achievement and recognition. Ethan Brooks had shown her a different definition, one measured in presence and priority and the conscious choice to value people over prestige. And while she was still learning, still making mistakes, still figuring out how to balance business demands with human needs, she was building something new, something better.
something that might actually be worth the life she invested in it. The work continued, imperfect and ongoing, but grounded now in principles that would sustain rather than consume. And in the quiet moments when Sophie laughed at something her father said, or Ethan smiled with the contentment of someone living according to his values, Avery caught glimpses of what she was building toward. Not empire, but equilibrium. Not dominance, but dignity. Not success at any cost, but success worth having. The transformation of Cole Aviation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without resistance. 6 months after implementing the new policies, Avery sat in a contentious board meeting watching 3 of her investors argue that she was sacrificing profitability for sentiment, that her competitor Prestige Air was gaining market share, that the work-life balance experiment needed to end before it destroyed everything she'd built. Robert Chen, her largest investor, leaned forward with the expression of a man losing patience. "Avery, we respect what you're trying to do, but the numbers don't lie. Revenue is down 8%. Operational costs are up 12%, and we're losing contracts to competitors who can promise 24/7 availability. How long do you expect us to watch our investment deteriorate?" She'd prepared for this, had known it was coming, but the familiar pressure still settled on her shoulders. The weight of other people's money, other people's expectations, the old instinct to defend and justify and prove that she could deliver results by any definition they wanted. But then she thought about Sarah, who'd quit rather than miss another of her son's milestones. About Marcus, who'd started leaving by 6 every evening and had stopped looking perpetually exhausted. About the 3 new mechanics she'd hired who actually smiled when they came to work because they knew their schedules were predictable and their family time was protected. And she thought about Ethan, who'd shown her that some things were worth more than profitability. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "Revenue is down. But employee turnover is down 60%. Sick days are down 40%. Our safety record is the best it's been in 5 years. Client satisfaction scores are actually up, despite reduced availability, because the people serving them are rested and engaged rather than burned out and resentful." "That's all very nice," Chen interrupted, "but our investment isn't measured in employee happiness. It's measured in returns." "Then maybe you should reconsider your investment, because I'm not going back to the old model. I'm not building a company that consumes people's lives and calls it dedication. If that makes me a bad investment by your metrics, then I'll find investors with better metrics." The silence that followed was profound. She saw Derek's eyes widen slightly, saw the other board members exchange glances, saw Chen's expression shift from irritation to calculation. "You'd really walk away from our capital?" "I'd really build something sustainable over something profitable but destructive." "Yes." Chen leaned back, studying her with new eyes. "You've changed. The Avery Cole I invested in 2 years ago would have done whatever it took to show returns. The Avery Cole you invested in 2 years ago was heading for burnout and taking everyone around her down too. I'm building something better now. If you can't see the long-term value in that, then yes, we should part ways." She waited, heart pounding, knowing she might be about to lose the funding that had allowed Cole Aviation to expand, to compete, to establish itself as a major player. But she also knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she'd rather run a smaller company aligned with her values than a larger one that required betraying them. Chen was quiet for a long moment, then surprised her by laughing, a genuine sound that seemed to release the tension in the room. "You know what? I respect that. It's foolish and idealistic and probably going to cost us all money in the short term, but I respect it. Give me 2 more quarters to see if this model can actually work. If the numbers start improving, we stay invested. If they don't, we revisit this conversation." It was a reprieve, not a victory, but Avery would take it. The meeting adjourned and she found herself standing at her office window, watching aircraft take off and land, feeling the weight of uncertainty, but also, strangely, relief. She'd drawn a line, defended a principle, chosen values over easy profit. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Heard about the board meeting. Proud of you. Sophie wants to know if you're still coming to her science fair tomorrow." Avery smiled, typing back, "Wouldn't miss it. Tell her I can't wait to see her project." The science fair had become one of those unexpected joys that had crept into her life over the past months. Sophie had been working on an engineering project, a model aircraft with adjustable wing configurations to demonstrate different flight characteristics, and had enlisted both Avery and her father as consultants. Watching the 8-year-old's fierce concentration, her willingness to fail and try again, her pure love of learning, had become one of the highlights of Avery's increasingly recalibrated life. The next evening, she walked into the elementary school gymnasium, transformed into a showcase of childhood ingenuity and scientific curiosity. Sophie spotted her immediately and came running over wearing a dress that was clearly special occasion and a smile that could light cities. "You came! Dad said you would, but I wasn't sure because you're really busy and important." Avery knelt down to Sophie's eye level, a gesture she'd learned from watching Ethan. "I'm never too busy for this. Show me what you built." The project was remarkable, not just for an 8-year-old, but by any standard. Sophie had created a wind tunnel from materials you could find at a hardware store, built multiple wing configurations with adjustable angles, and documented how each design affected lift and drag. Her presentation board showed careful measurements, hand-drawn graphs, and observations written in the earnest handwriting of someone who cared deeply about getting it right. "Dad helped with some of the math," Sophie admitted, "but I did all the building and testing myself. And I learned that swept wings are better for high-speed flight, but straight wings give you more lift at slow speeds, which is why different planes have different shapes depending on what they need to do." "That's brilliant, Sophie, truly. Do you think I could be an aerospace engineer like my dad was?" Avery felt her throat tighten, seeing the hope and uncertainty in the child's expression. "I think you could be anything you want to be, but yes, I think you'd make an exceptional engineer." She found Ethan standing nearby, watching the interaction with an expression that was complex and unguarded, pride in his daughter, gratitude for Avery's presence, something else she couldn't quite name but felt in her chest like warmth. As other families arrived and Sophie was called away to present for the judges, Ethan moved to stand beside Avery. "Thank you for being here. It means a lot to her, to both of us." "I meant what I said. I wouldn't miss this." "I know. That's what makes it mean something." He paused, watching Sophie explain her project to a judge with animated hand gestures. "I heard about your board meeting, the whole find new investors if you don't like my values speech. Word travels fast. Derek may have called me to express a mixture of admiration and terror at your negotiating approach." Ethan smiled slightly. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing, even if it costs you in the short term. I learned from someone who walked away from more than I'm risking." "I didn't walk away. I walked toward something better. There's a difference." Before she could respond, the principal's voice came over the loudspeaker, announcing that judging was complete and they'd reveal the winners in 10 minutes. Sophie came bounding back, nervous energy radiating from every small movement. "What if I don't win? What if the judges think my project is too simple or boring or—" "Then you'll have learned something from the experience and you'll build something even better next time," Ethan said calmly. "Winning isn't why we do science, sweetheart. We do it because we're curious and we want to understand how things work." "But it would be nice to win." "It would, but it would be nicer to be someone who loves learning regardless of whether you win." The wisdom of it, delivered with such gentle certainty, made Avery's chest ache. She'd spent her life chasing wins, measuring worth through victories, defining success by external validation. Watching Ethan teach his daughter a different metric, curiosity over competition, understanding over accolades, felt like witnessing something sacred. When they announced Sophie's name as the first-place winner in the third-grade division, the girl's face lit up with pure joy. But what struck Avery was that the happiness seemed less about winning and more about having her work recognized, about adults understanding what she'd tried to communicate through her project. As they walked to the car later, Sophie chattering between them about what project she wanted to try next, Avery felt an unexpected sense of completeness. Not because she'd solved all her problems or figured everything out, but because this moment of shared joy in a child's achievement, this quiet evening that prioritized presence over productivity, this felt right in ways that closing contracts never quite had. "Ice cream?" Ethan suggested. "To celebrate?" "Yes!" Sophie pumped her fist. "Can Avery come?" "If she wants to." They both looked at her, and Avery found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided. "I'd love to." The ice cream shop was busy with other celebrating families, the air filled with the sounds of children's laughter and parents' conversations. They found a booth in the corner, Sophie between them, and Avery watched the easy affection between father and daughter, the way he automatically grabbed extra napkins knowing she'd need them, the way she leaned against his shoulder while eating, the unspoken communication of two people who knew each other completely. Avery? Sophie looked up at her with serious eyes. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you have kids? The question landed with unexpected weight. No, I don't. Why not? You'd be a good mom. You're nice and you bring good snacks and you came to my science fair even though you're busy. Avery glanced at Ethan, who looked equally uncertain about how to redirect his daughter's curiosity. I've been focused on my career, building my company. I thought those things were more important. More important than kids? I thought so. I'm not sure anymore. Sophie considered this, taking another bite of her ice cream. Dad says the most important things are the ones that matter even when nobody's watching, like being there for people and keeping promises and being kind even when it's hard. Is your company like that? From the mouths of children came questions that cut to the core of everything. Avery felt Ethan's eyes on her, waiting for her answer, and she found herself giving Sophie the same honesty she would an adult. It's becoming like that. I'm trying to make it be about people mattering, not just profits. Your dad taught me that. He's really good at teaching, Sophie said matter-of-factly. He taught me about engines and also about how to be brave when I'm scared and how to keep trying even when something's hard. He taught me some of those things too. The girl smiled, clearly pleased to have this common ground. Then maybe you can both teach me more stuff, like you could show me how businesses work, and Dad could show me more engineering, and together you could show me how grown-ups be friends even when they're different. The innocent proposal hung in the air, suggesting a future that Avery hadn't let herself imagine. Not romance necessarily, but connection, ongoing presence in each other's lives, the kind of relationship that defied easy categorization but mattered anyway. Ethan cleared his throat. Sophie, that's a lovely idea, Avery finished, surprising herself. I'd like that very much. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Ethan continued his consulting work with Cole Aviation, now expanded into a formal arrangement that respected his boundaries while utilizing his expertise. Sophie became a regular presence at the office after school, doing homework in the corner while her father worked, occasionally asking questions that forced the entire team to explain complex concepts in 8-year-old friendly terms. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the lines between professional collaboration and personal connection began to blur. Avery found herself at more of Sophie's school events, invited to casual dinners that weren't business meetings, included in weekend activities that had nothing to do with aviation. And Ethan, while maintaining his careful boundaries, began to trust her in ways that went beyond professional respect. The breakthrough came 4 months after the science fair, when a crisis forced both of them to confront what they'd been carefully avoiding. Cole Aviation received an opportunity that was simultaneously perfect and impossible. A contract to provide executive transport services for a major tech company's international operations. It was the kind of deal that could transform the company, that validated everything Avery had been working toward, that represented exactly the success she'd always dreamed of. The catch was that it required extensive international travel, unpredictable scheduling, and the kind of operational commitment that would strain the new policies she'd implemented. Taking it would mean asking her team to sacrifice the work-life balance they'd finally achieved. Refusing it would mean passing on the opportunity that could secure the company's future. She sat in her office late one evening, reviewing the contract terms for the 100th time, when Ethan knocked on the doorframe. Derek said you've been here since 5 this morning. I'm trying to figure out how to make this work without destroying everything we've built. He came in, sat across from her, and waited until she looked up. Talk to me. She explained the opportunity, the impossible choice, the way success and sustainability seemed to be on opposite ends of a spectrum she couldn't bridge. He listened without interrupting, his presence steady and calm. What do you want to do? He asked when she finished. I want both. I want the contract and the culture. I want success and sustainability. I want to prove you can build something exceptional without consuming people's lives. Then you need to get creative about structure.
This contract doesn't have to be all or nothing. You could create a specialized division specifically for international operations, staff it with people who want that lifestyle, pay premium rates to compensate for the demands, and keep it separate from your standard operations. Give people a choice rather than making demands. The solution was so obvious once he said it that Avery felt foolish for not seeing it herself. A separate division with different expectations and different compensation structures. Exactly. Some people thrive on the intensity and travel. Others need stability and predictability. You can serve both needs if you design the organization right. She paused, seeing the larger implications. That's essentially what you did, isn't it? You created a life structure that serves your needs instead of trying to fit into someone else's definition of success. I did. And I won't lie, it costs me opportunities. There are projects I'd love to take on but can't because they don't fit my constraints. But the life I have with Sophie is worth more than the opportunities I miss. Avery studied him across the desk, this man who'd fundamentally altered her understanding of success. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Okay. What are we doing? Not the consulting work, not the professional collaboration. What is this between us? She saw him tense slightly, saw the careful walls start to rise, but pressed forward anyway. Because Sophie asked me if we were friends, and I said yes, but I don't think that's the whole truth anymore. And I need to know if I'm imagining this connection, or if you feel it too. Ethan was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. I feel it, and it terrifies me. Why? Because I can't. Sophie has to be my priority, and any relationship I have needs to work around that reality. I can't give you evenings or weekends or spontaneous plans. I can't be the partner who drops everything for romantic gestures or last-minute trips. My life has constraints that most people wouldn't accept. I'm not most people. No, you're not. But Avery, you're also someone who's still figuring out what you want your life to be. You're in transition, questioning foundations, rebuilding your understanding of success. I won't be someone's experiment while they figure themselves out. The honesty of it stung, but she couldn't argue with the logic. He was right. She was still in flux, still learning, still discovering what mattered to her. So what do we do? We keep being honest. We keep building this friendship or partnership or whatever it becomes. We don't rush, don't force, don't try to make it into something it's not ready to be. And we protect Sophie above everything because if this goes wrong, she's the one who'll be hurt. Avery nodded, feeling both disappointment and relief. I can do that. Slow, honest, protective of Sophie. Those are good boundaries. They're necessary ones. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. But Avery, I'm glad you asked, because pretending we don't feel this would have been worse than acknowledging it. She spent the next week implementing his suggestion, creating a new international operations division with selective recruitment and premium compensation. The response surprised her. She had multiple team members volunteer for the new structure, excited by the challenge and the travel, appreciating that it was a choice rather than a mandate. The tech company accepted her proposal, and Cole Aviation secured the contract without sacrificing the culture she'd fought to build. The board meeting following the announcement was notably different from the contentious one 6 months earlier. Chen actually smiled when presenting the financial projections. I'll admit, he said, I didn't think this would work, but you've proven that you can grow sustainably. The new division model is actually brilliant. It gives you operational flexibility without burning out your core team. It wasn't my idea, Avery admitted. I had help from someone who understands how to structure life around priorities rather than trying to fit priorities into existing structures. Derek caught her eye across the conference table, a knowing expression on his face that suggested he knew exactly who she was talking about. The success brought new opportunities, but Avery found herself evaluating them through different criteria now. Not just profitability or market expansion, but impact on her team, alignment with her values, sustainability over the long term. She turned down contracts that would have made her rich but miserable, accepted smaller opportunities that felt right, and gradually built a company that looked different from the industry standard but worked better for everyone involved. And through it all, Ethan remained a steady presence. Not quite partner, not quite consultant, something undefined but essential. They fell into patterns of collaboration that felt natural, Conversations that ranged from technical to personal, a growing ease that came from genuine trust. Sophie's 9th birthday arrived in early September, and Avery found herself invited to the celebration, a small gathering at a local park with a handful of classmates, Mrs. Patterson and her husband, Tyler from the hangar, and Avery. She watched Ethan organize games and serve cake, his complete focus on making his daughter's day perfect, and felt something settle in her chest that she was finally ready to name. It wasn't just respect or attraction or gratitude for what he'd taught her. It was love, the slow-building kind that came from really knowing someone, from watching how they move through the world, from recognizing in them qualities you wanted to cultivate in yourself. But she also understood, watching him with Sophie, that his boundaries were real and right. He was a father first, and any relationship he had would always take second place to that. The question was whether she could accept that position, whether her love was generous enough to embrace constraints she'd spent her life avoiding. As the party wound down and parents collected their children, Sophie ran up to Avery with dirt on her dress and joy on her face. "Best birthday ever! Thank you for coming and for the telescope you got me. Dad says we're going to use it to look at planets. I'm so glad you liked it. Will you come stargazing with us sometime? Dad's teaching me constellations, but he says you probably know different ones because you've been to more places." Avery glanced at Ethan, who was watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'd love to. If your dad says it's okay." "It's more than okay," Ethan said quietly. "It would be nice." That night, after helping clean up, after saying goodbye to the other guests, Avery found herself lingering as Ethan loaded party supplies into his truck and Sophie collapsed in the back seat, exhausted from joy and sugar. "Thank you for including me," she said. "You're important to Sophie, to both of us." "Ethan, can I ask you something else? And you can say no, and it won't change anything between us, I promise." He turned to face her fully, cautious but open. "What is it?" "Would you be willing to consider, slowly, carefully, at whatever pace works for you, exploring what this could be? Not now, not rushed, but eventually. When I've proven that I've really changed, that I understand what matters, that I can be someone who fits into your life instead of trying to make you fit into mine." She saw surprise flash across his features, followed by something that looked like hope tempered with fear. "You're asking me to consider a relationship?" "I'm asking you to keep the door open to possibility. I know I need to keep growing, keep proving that these changes are real and lasting. I know Sophie has to be protected and prioritized. I know it would be complicated and unconventional and nothing like either of us probably imagined. But Ethan, I think we could build something really good if we're both willing to try." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at his sleeping daughter in the truck, then back at Avery. "I need time. I need to see that you're sure. That this isn't just the excitement of change or the attraction of something different. Because if we do this and it doesn't work, Sophie gets hurt. I get hurt. And I can't, I know, take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Okay? Then, yeah, the door stays open. But Avery, the path through it is going to be slow and careful and full of considerations that have nothing to do with us and everything to do with an 8-year-old girl who's already lost her mother. I wouldn't want it any other way. The months that followed were some of the most challenging and rewarding of Avery's life. She continued rebuilding Cole Aviation, implementing new programs that attracted talent precisely because they respected human limitations. She created a fellowship for parents in technical fields, offering flexible arrangements that let engineers and mechanics balance expertise with family needs. She partnered with local schools on STEM education, using company resources to inspire the next generation. And quietly, carefully, she built a life that could accommodate a relationship with boundaries she'd never imagined accepting. She learned to plan around Sophie's schedule, to find joy in school events and weekend projects, to measure time not in productivity, but in presence. She discovered that saying no to business opportunities felt less like sacrifice when it meant saying yes to people who mattered. Ethan, for his part, gradually lowered his walls. He invited her to more family activities, included her in decisions about Sophie's education and activities, let her see the parts of his life he usually kept private. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, what they had transformed from friendship into something deeper, not defined by grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but built through consistent presence and mutual growth. The moment Avery knew she'd really changed came 10 months after the conversation at Sophie's birthday party. She received a call from an international client offering a lucrative consulting opportunity that would require 2 weeks in London, meetings with aviation executives, networking with industry leaders, exactly the kind of high-profile work she'd once craved. 3 years ago, she would have said yes immediately. 2 years ago, she would have asked Derek to handle her schedule. 1 year ago, she would have struggled with the decision. Now, she looked at her calendar and saw that those 2 weeks included Sophie's school science showcase, where the girl would be presenting an advanced project on propulsion systems, and she didn't hesitate. I appreciate the offer, but I have commitments here that I can't reschedule. If there's flexibility on the timeline, I'd be happy to discuss alternatives. The client, predictably, found someone else. Avery felt no regret. She showed up to Sophie's presentation wearing a dress instead of a suit, carrying flowers instead of a briefcase, and watched a 9-year-old girl explain engine dynamics with the passion of someone who'd learned from the best. Ethan stood beside her, their shoulders touching, and when Sophie finished to enthusiastic applause, he turned to Avery with an expression of such complete trust and affection that she felt her breath catch. "She asked me this morning if she should call you Aunt Avery," he said quietly. "I told her she could call you whatever felt right, but that, yes, you're family now." The word landed with the weight of commitment and promise. Family. Not through blood or marriage, but through choice and consistency, and the slow building of trust. "Is that okay with you?" he continued. "The idea of being family, even if we're still figuring out exactly what shape that takes?" "It's more than okay. It's perfect." So that evening, after the showcase, after the celebratory dinner, after Sophie was asleep in the back of Ethan's truck, he asked Avery if she wanted to take a walk. They ended up at a small park near the hangar, sitting on a bench under stars that Sophie's new telescope would eventually help them name. "I've been thinking about what you said at Sophie's birthday, about exploring this carefully." Avery's heart rate picked up, but she kept her voice calm. And I think we've been exploring it this whole time, just without calling it what it is. You've been part of our lives for almost a year now. You've proven that you mean it, that the changes are real, that you understand what matters, that you can build a life that accommodates constraints you used to think were impossible. So what are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we stop pretending this is just friendship or partnership. Maybe we acknowledge that somewhere along the way, while we were being careful and slow, we fell into something that looks a lot like love. My kind of love, with boundaries and priorities and a 9-year-old at the center of everything, but still, love. Avery felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind that came from joy rather than pain. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot. It won't always be easy. Sophie will always come first. My work schedule is built around her needs. Our relationship will have to fit into spaces between parenting and responsibility and all the things that matter more than romance. I know, and that's exactly what makes this right. You showed me that the best relationships don't demand sacrifice of the things that matter most. They enhance them. Being part of your life, part of Sophie's life, makes me better, makes everything better. He reached for her hand, his fingers rough from work but gentle in their touch. Then let's do this. Slowly, carefully, with the understanding that we're building something that needs to last, because Sophie's attached to you now and I won't let her be hurt. I won't hurt her. I won't hurt either of you. That's my promise. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching stars that seemed brighter than they had any right to be. And Avery thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the woman who'd mocked a mechanic in a hangar to someone who understood that real worth couldn't be measured by job titles or bank accounts. The year that followed brought its own challenges and triumphs. Coal aviation continued to grow, but differently than Avery had once imagined. Not just in size, but in purpose. Not just in profit, but in impact. The fellowship program attracted talented engineers who'd left the industry for family reasons, bringing expertise and gratitude and a work ethic built on choice rather than obligation. Ethan gradually expanded his role, not into traditional employment, but into something that worked for his life, consulting on complex problems, teaching occasionally at the technical college, mentoring young mechanics who wanted to understand the why behind the how. And Avery learned to navigate a relationship that defied conventional structures, finding joy in the unconventional rhythms of a life built around a child's needs. Sophie, for her part, thrived under the attention of two adults who both understood that intelligence needed nurturing and curiosity deserved encouragement. She grew taller, bolder, more confident in her abilities and her worth, and she accepted Avery's presence in her life with the easy grace of a child who'd been taught that love came in many forms. The moment that felt like completion came on a Saturday afternoon in late spring at a company event Avery had organized, a showcase of the fellowship program's achievements. Engineers and mechanics presented projects they'd developed while maintaining family balance, demonstrated innovations that came from having the mental space to be creative, told stories of careers rescued from burnout. Sophie was there, having insisted on coming to support the grown-ups doing cool science, and she wandered through the displays with fascination. At one point, she stopped in front of a presentation on sustainable aviation fuel, studying the chemical equations with intensity that would have been comical if it weren't so genuine. The engineer presenting, a woman named Maria, who'd returned to the industry after 5 years as a stay-at-home mom, noticed Sophie's interest and knelt down to her level. "You like chemistry?" "I like understanding how things work. My dad says the best engineers are curious about everything." "Your dad sounds smart. What does he do?" "He fixes airplanes, but he used to design engines. He gave it up when my mom died so he could take care of me." Maria's expression softened with understanding. That must have been a hard choice for him. Sophie considered this seriously. "I don't think it was hard. I think he just knew what mattered more. He told me once that engines are amazing, but people are irreplaceable. So when you have to choose, you always choose people." Avery, listening from a few feet away, felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. She'd spent a decade choosing engines, metaphorically and sometimes literally, and she'd built something impressive in the process, something she could be proud of. But watching Sophie explain complex concepts to an engineer who'd made the same choice her father had, seeing the community of people who'd found a way to balance excellence and humanity, understanding that she'd helped create a space where those choices weren't mutually exclusive, that felt like success in ways that quarterly earnings never had. Ethan found her later, after the presentations concluded and people mingled over refreshments that included both Sophie's beloved cookies and the healthy options he insisted on. "Quite a turnout. You should be proud." "We should be proud. This doesn't happen without your influence, without the example you set. I just lived according to my values. You're the one who figured out how to scale that to an organizational level." She leaned into him slightly, enjoying the solid warmth of his presence. "I couldn't have done it without you showing me it was possible, without you proving that walking away from traditional success could lead to something better. You know what the best part is?" He gestured around the room, at the fellowship participants sharing ideas, at Sophie engaged in animated conversation with Maria about chemical reactions, at the evidence of a company culture that actually valued what it claimed to prioritize. "The best part is that we didn't have to choose. You didn't have to give up coal aviation to have a life. I didn't have to sacrifice Sophie to use my expertise. We found a way to integrate instead of choosing." "The wings of humility," Avery said softly. "What?" "Something I've been thinking about, the phrase. We spend so much time chasing height and speed and power, building engines that can go faster, higher, farther. But the real achievement isn't the altitude. It's knowing when to fly and when to land. It's having the humility to recognize that being grounded can be more important than being impressive." Ethan smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in the way it only did when he was truly content. "I like that. Though I'd argue that you can fly high if you've built your life on solid ground. It's not about choosing between ambition and humanity. It's about making sure your ambition is in service of your humanity instead of at the expense of it." Sophie appeared then, tugging on Avery's sleeve with the impatience of a child who'd discovered something exciting and needed to share it immediately. "Avery, Maria said that if I keep studying chemistry and engineering, I could help design cleaner airplane fuels when I grow up. She said kids like me who understand both the science and why it matters are exactly what the industry needs. Isn't that cool?"
That's incredibly cool. Are you thinking about becoming an engineer? Maybe. Or a teacher like Dad so I can help other kids learn about cool stuff. Or maybe both. Maria says you don't have to pick one thing forever. You can be lots of things at different times in your life. Avery caught Ethan's eye over Sophie's head, saw the pride and love there, and felt her own heart expand with the recognition of what they'd built together. Not a traditional family, not a conventional relationship, but something real and sustainable and full of possibility. 6 months later, Cole Aviation hosted its annual company gathering, and Avery stood before her assembled team with Sophie beside her. The girl had asked to say a few words about the fellowship program's impact on families like hers, and Avery had gratefully agreed. "Hi, everyone," Sophie began, her voice clear despite obvious nervousness. "I'm Sophie Brooks, and I wanted to talk about what it's like when grown-ups get their priorities right." There was gentle laughter from the audience, and Sophie smiled, gaining confidence. "My dad used to have a really important job designing engines, but when I was born and my mom died, he decided I was more important than engines. For a long time, I thought that meant he gave up something big, but then I met Avery and she showed me something different." The girl looked up at Avery, her expression serious and sincere. "She showed me that you don't have to choose between being excellent at your work and being there for people you love. You just have to build things differently. You have to make space for both. And when you do that, you get companies like this one, where my dad can use his expertise and still make my soccer games, where people like Maria can come back to work they love without missing their kids growing up, where success means doing great work and having great lives." She paused, looking out at the audience with the wisdom that came from being raised by someone who understood what mattered. "My dad says the strongest engines are the ones that know when to rest. I think he means that people are like that too. We're better when we're balanced, when we work hard but also play hard, when we chase dreams but also remember why the dreams matter in the first place." The applause was genuine and sustained, and Sophie blushed but stood tall, clearly pleased with herself. Avery wrapped an arm around the girl's shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility and privilege, the trust Ethan had placed in her by letting Sophie be part of this, the future they were building together that honored past sacrifices while creating new possibilities. That evening, after the gathering concluded and most people had gone home, Avery stood in the hangar that had started everything. The Gulfstream G700 that Ethan had first repaired sat gleaming in the overhead lights, a reminder of how much had changed in the 2 years since he'd mocked her assumptions and proven himself right. Ethan found her there, Sophie already asleep in his truck after a long day of being charming and articulate. "Thinking about the first time we met?" he asked. "Thinking about how wrong I was. About you, about success, about what makes a life worth living. You weren't wrong, you just had incomplete information. Now you know better." "Now I know better," she agreed. Yet, she turned to face him, this man who'd changed everything by refusing to compromise on what mattered. "Thank you for being stubborn about your priorities, for showing me there was a different way, for letting me be part of your life even when I didn't deserve the chance. You deserved it. You just needed time to grow into it." He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Besides, you've changed my life too. Sophie has opportunities now she wouldn't have had. I get to use my expertise in ways I'd forgotten were possible. We have a community of people who understand what we're trying to build. That's not nothing." "It's everything," Avery whispered. And standing there in the hangar, surrounded by aircraft that represented both their shared passion and their hard-won balance, Avery understood that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Not empire or dominance or the hollow victory of success at any cost, but something infinitely more valuable. A life built on principles worth defending, relationships worth nurturing, and the profound recognition that the most powerful engines weren't always the ones that flew the highest. Sometimes they were the ones that knew when to land, when to rest, when to prioritize the human connections that gave flight its purpose. Sometimes the real achievement wasn't reaching new altitudes, but building a foundation strong enough to support whatever heights you chose to pursue. The wings of humility, she thought again, watching Ethan check on Sophie through the truck window with the eternal vigilance of a devoted father. The wisdom to know that being grounded wasn't failure. It was the essential prerequisite for any flight worth taking. And as they walked together toward the parking lot, toward home and rest, and the life they'd carefully constructed from hard lessons and harder choices, Avery felt a peace she'd never known in all her years of chasing conventional success. Because this balance of excellence and humanity, ambition and presence, achievement and love, this was what winning actually looked like when you measured it against what truly mattered. The engines would always be there, ready to soar when the time was right. But the people who gave those flights meaning, who made the journey worthwhile, who reminded you why you'd learned to fly in the first place, they were irreplaceable, invaluable, and finally, rightfully, first.